In the heart of Montana's unforgiving winter, a pregnant widow struggles alone against nature's fury. Clara Mae Larkins swings her axe through frozen wood, each strike echoing her desperation. Her late husband's cabin creaks under snow's weight, and her dwindling woodpile won't last another week. Then fate brings Jedediah Boone to her door, a broken-down cowboy with nothing but the clothes on his back and a heart bigger than the Montana sky. He's been drifting from town to town, carrying secrets from his past and looking for redemption in honest work. When he finds Clara collapsed in the snow, something stirs in his weathered soul. What starts as simple kindness becomes something deeper as the blizzard traps them together. Through long winter nights, two wounded hearts begin to heal beside a crackling fire. But when Clara's time comes and the storm rages fiercer than ever, will this unlikely pair find the strength to face what lies ahead? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Montana Territory in the winter of 1882 was no place for the faint of heart, and Clara Mae Larkins had never considered herself anything but strong. She'd proven that strength when she'd married Thomas Larkins at 17, leaving behind the relative comfort of her father's mercantile in Billings to follow her husband to this remote homestead 40 miles from the nearest settlement. She'd proven it again when she'd learned to cook over an open fire, to mend clothes by candlelight, and to shoot straight enough to put meat on their table when Thomas was away trapping. But standing now in the doorway of their one-room cabin, watching the wind whip snow across the landscape like nature's own fury, Clara felt that strength wavering for the first time in her 23 years. Her hands, red and cracked from the cold, rested on the swell of her belly where their child grew, a child Thomas would never meet. The consumption had taken him in September, just as the first leaves began to turn. One day he'd been splitting logs for their winter supply, his laughter echoing across the valley when she'd called him in for supper. The next, he was burning with fever, coughing up blood that stained their few clean rags crimson. By the time the first snow fell, she'd buried him in the small grove of aspens behind the cabin, marking his grave with a simple wooden cross he'd carved himself the summer before, never knowing its purpose. Now, 3 months later, Clara faced the harsh reality of Montana winter alone. The cabin Thomas had built with such pride, solid logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke cleanly, windows fitted with real glass he'd hauled from town, felt more like a trap than a shelter. The roof leaked in 2 places, dripping steadily into tin pans she'd placed on the floor. The door, warped from moisture and settling, no longer closed properly, allowing drafts to snake through the gaps. And the wood, Lord, the wood was running dangerously low. She'd been trying to split logs for weeks now, but her pregnant body wasn't built for such labor. Each swing of Thomas's heavy axe sent shockwaves through her back and shoulders. Her hands, soft from years of lighter work, had blistered and bled until they'd finally calloused over. Still, the pile of split wood dwindled daily, while the stack of unsplit logs seemed to mock her efforts. The worst part wasn't the physical hardship. Clara had always been practical about such things. The worst part was the silence. Thomas had been a man of few words, but his presence had filled their small cabin with warmth. He'd hum while he worked, tell stories of his trapping expeditions while they ate supper, read aloud from their single book, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets, on long winter evenings. Now the only sounds were the wind howling through the gaps in the walls and the crackle of the fire she fed with increasingly precious fuel. She'd considered leaving, of course. Her father would welcome her back to town, would insist on it if he knew her circumstances. But something in Clara's heart rebelled against the idea. This place held Thomas's spirit, his dreams, his labor. Every log in the walls, every stone in the chimney, every carefully tended inch of the small garden plot now buried under snow. It all spoke of the life they'd planned together, the future they'd dreamed of for their child. Besides, travel in Her condition in this weather would be more dangerous than staying put. The nearest neighbor was old Henrik Paulsen, a Norwegian bachelor who trapped beaver in the creek bottoms and kept mostly to himself. She'd seen smoke from his chimney as recently as last week, so she knew he was still alive, but Henrik wasn't the sort to check on folks uninvited. The Millers lived 15 miles east, but their ranch was snowed in most winters, same as everyone else in these parts. Clara had supplies, enough flour and salt pork to last until spring if she was careful, a root cellar Thomas had dug that kept their potatoes and turnips from freezing. She had Thomas's rifle and knew how to use it, though hunting in her condition was out of the question. She had warm clothes, sturdy boots, and the quilts her mother had sent as a wedding gift. What she didn't have was enough wood to keep the fire burning through the worst of winter, and without fire none of the rest mattered. That's what had driven her outside this morning, despite the bitter wind and the ache in her lower back that had kept her awake most of the night. The woodpile was down to perhaps a week's worth of fuel, and the weather showed no signs of letting up. Fresh snow had fallen overnight, adding another 6 inches to the drifts that already reached the cabin's windows. But there was no choice. She had to keep trying to split what remained of the unsplit logs, had to keep the fire burning, had to survive until spring. The axe felt heavier today than it had yesterday, and yesterday it had felt like lifting a mountain. Clara positioned herself carefully, trying to find her balance with the weight of the baby shifting her center of gravity. The log before her was a thick section of pine, seasoned and dry. Good burning wood if she could just split it properly. She raised the axe, feeling the familiar strain in her shoulders, and brought it down with all the force she could muster. The blade bit into the wood but didn't split it clean through. She'd have to work at it, chopping away bit by bit, until she could finally pry the pieces apart. It was inefficient, exhausting work, but it was all she could manage. Thomas had made it look so easy, his powerful arms swinging the axe in smooth, practiced arcs that sent logs flying apart in perfect halves. She'd often watched him from the cabin doorway, admiring the grace of his movements, the satisfaction in his face when a particularly stubborn piece finally surrendered. Now, struggling to pull the axe free from where it had lodged in the wood, Clara felt tears freezing on her cheeks before she realized she was crying. Not from pain or fear, but from the simple, overwhelming reality of how much she missed him. Missed his strength, his gentle presence, his absolute certainty that they could make a life together in this wild place. "Thomas," she whispered to the wind, her breath forming crystals in the frigid air. "I don't know if I can do this without you." The wind seemed to answer with a howl that shook the cabin walls, and Clara gripped the axe handle tighter, summoning what remained of her strength for another swing. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her distress, and she placed one hand on her belly. "I know, little one," she murmured. "Your papa would want us to keep fighting. He'd want us to make it through to spring." She raised the axe again, muscles trembling with effort and cold, and brought it down. This time, the wood split with a satisfying crack, and Clara felt a small surge of triumph. One piece down, dozens more to go. But it was progress, and progress was all she had to hold on to. Meanwhile, some 30 miles north, Jedediah Boone was having his own conversation with the Montana wind. His mule, Mercy, plodded through the snow with the resigned patience of an animal long accustomed to hardship, her breath steaming in the cold air. Jed pulled his patch coat tighter around his shoulders and adjusted the battered hat that had seen him through 5 years of wandering. He was a man carved by hard living, tall and lean, with hands weathered by rope and reins, sun and wind. His face bore the lines of someone who'd spent more time squinting at horizons than sitting in comfortable chairs, and his grey eyes held the particular weariness of a man who'd seen too much of the world's sharp edges. At 34, he felt older than his years, worn down by choices that had seemed right at the time, but had led him further and further from anything resembling home. The buffalo were mostly gone now, hunted nearly to extinction by men like himself. who'd followed the herds across the plains with rifles and skinning knives, taking hides for eastern markets that paid well for the privilege of destroying something magnificent. Jed had been good at that work, too good perhaps. His knife had been among the sharpest, his aim among the truest, his willingness to push deeper into dangerous territory greater than most. He'd made decent money in the trade, enough to send some home to his sister's family in Kansas, enough to keep himself in supplies and whiskey, but the work had hollowed something out of him, left him feeling complicit in an ending that shouldn't have come so soon. When the herds finally dwindled to nothing and the other hunters drifted away to find new ways to make a living, Jed had found himself at loose ends, carrying skills that were no longer needed and a restless guilt that whiskey couldn't quite wash away. For the past 2 years, he'd been drifting from town to town, taking whatever work he could find. He'd cowboyed for a season in Wyoming, hauled freight through Colorado mountain passes, even tried his hand at prospecting in the Montana goldfields. Nothing stuck. Nothing felt like more than marking time until something else came along, something that might restore the sense of purpose that had died with the last buffalo. Now, with winter settling hard over the territory and most sensible folks hunkered down to wait for spring, Jed was caught between destinations with nowhere particular to go. He'd left Great Falls 3 days ago when the saloon owner who'd been letting him sleep in the back room decided he'd overstayed his welcome. His destination was vague, maybe Billings, maybe further south toward Wyoming, anywhere that might have work for a man with strong hands and few prospects. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally began in earnest, fat snowflakes giving way to wind-driven sleet that stung his face and made Mercy lower her head against the weather. Jed knew they needed shelter, and soon the temperature was dropping fast, and even with his heavy coat and wool socks, he could feel the cold seeping into his bones. That's when he saw the smoke. It was just a thin column rising from a stand of trees maybe a mile off the trail, barely visible through the thickening snow. But smoke meant fire, and fire meant shelter. And right now, that was worth more than his pride. Jed turned Mercy toward the distant trees, hoping whoever lived there might spare a man and his mule a spot to wait out the worst of the storm. The cabin, when he finally reached it, was smaller than he'd expected. A single-room structure that looked well-built but showed signs of hard use. What caught his attention immediately was the sound of chopping, rhythmic but labored, coming from behind the building. Someone was splitting wood in this weather, and from the sound of it, they were having a hard time of it. Jed dismounted and led Mercy around the side of the cabin, calling out as he approached. "Hello, the house. Don't mean to startle anybody. Just looking for—" The words died in his throat as he saw her, a woman, heavily pregnant, struggling with an axe that was clearly too heavy for her to manage properly. She'd stopped chopping at the sound of his voice and stood facing him with the axe raised defensively, her face flushed with exertion and fear. For a moment, they simply stared at each other across the snowy yard. The pregnant woman with her protective stance, and the weather-beaten cowboy with his hands carefully visible and empty. Something passed between them in that silence, some recognition of shared human vulnerability in the face of Montana's indifferent winter. Then Clara's knees buckled, and she collapsed into the snow. Jedediah moved faster than he had in years, dropping Mercy's lead rope and lunging through the snow toward the fallen woman. She hadn't lost consciousness completely. He could see her trying to push herself up, one hand pressed to her swollen belly, the other still gripping that damned heavy axe like it was the only thing keeping her tethered to the world. "Easy there, ma'am," he said, his voice gentler than it had been in months of talking only to his mule and the occasional bartender. "Don't try to get up just yet. Let me help you." Clara's eyes, he noticed, were the color of autumn leaves, brown shot through with gold, and they regarded him with a mixture of wariness and desperate calculation. She was trying to decide if he posed more of a threat than the cold, and he could see the moment when survival won out over caution. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice shook with exhaustion. "Just caught my breath wrong." "Yes, ma'am. Jed replied, though they both knew she was lying. All the same, this ain't weather for outdoor work. Why don't we get you inside where it's warm? He extended his hand, palm up, waiting for her permission. Trust, he'd learned long ago, couldn't be rushed, especially not with a woman alone and vulnerable. When she finally nodded and reached for his offered hand, he felt something settle in his chest, a relief he hadn't expected. Clara was lighter than she looked, her frame delicate despite the pregnancy that made her movements awkward. As Jed helped her to her feet, he caught sight of her hands and had to suppress a curse. They were raw with blisters, some fresh, others scabbed over, the knuckles cracked and bleeding from the cold. These weren't the hands of a woman accustomed to heavy labor. "Your husband about?" he asked, as they made their slow way toward the cabin door, though something in the set of her shoulders already suggested the answer. "No," Clara said simply, and Jed heard volumes in that single word. Widowed then, and recently enough that she hadn't yet learned to manage alone. That explained the desperation he'd seen in her face, the way she'd been swinging that axe like her life depended on it. The cabin's interior was warmer than outside, but not by much. The fire in the stone hearth was burning low, more ember than flame, and Jed could see his breath in the air. Clara made her way to a chair near the fireplace, the only chair, he noticed, and sank into it with a soft groan of relief. "Ma'am," Jed said, removing his hat and holding it respectfully in his hands, "I don't mean to intrude on your privacy, but that fire needs tending, and you shouldn't be out there splitting wood in your condition. If you'd permit me, I could—" "I don't know you," Clara interrupted, though her tone held more exhaustion than hostility. "I don't know your name or where you come from or what you want." "Name's Jedediah Boone," he said, setting his hat on the small table that seemed to serve as both workspace and dining area. "Most folks call me Jed. I'm traveling south from Great Falls, looking for work, and I got caught in this storm. I was hoping you might let me and my mule shelter here until it passes." Clara studied his face, and Jed forced himself to stand still under her scrutiny. He was used to being judged. A drifter with patched clothes and no visible means of support invited suspicion wherever he went. But something in this woman's gaze was different, more thoughtful than fearful. "What kind of work?" she asked. "Whatever needs doing," Jed replied, honestly. "I've cowboyed, hunted, hauled freight. I'm handy with tools, good with animals. I'm not afraid of hard work, if that's what you're asking. And you just happen to be passing by?" "There's no trail that leads by here." Jed almost smiled at that. Sharp, this one, even exhausted and overwhelmed as she was. "No, ma'am, there isn't. I saw your smoke and turned off the main trail looking for shelter. I'll be honest with you, if I'd known you were alone out here, I might have kept riding. A woman in your situation doesn't need the complication of strange men showing up at her door. That seemed to surprise her." "Then why are you here?" "Because you collapsed in the snow," Jed said simply, "and because that fire's about to die out, and because you've got maybe 3 days' worth of split wood in that pile outside, and because—" He paused, searching for words to explain something he didn't fully understand himself. "Because sometimes a man finds himself in a place where he can help, and walking away would make him less than he wants to be." Clara was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on her belly where the baby was apparently active. Jed could see small movements rippling across the fabric of her dress. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "My name is Clara Larkins. This was my husband's homestead. He died in September. I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Larkins." "It's Clara," she said, "and thank you. Thomas he was a good man. He built this place with his own hands, planned to make it into something fine. He would have wanted—" She trailed off, then seemed to gather herself. "He would have wanted me to offer you shelter from the storm. There's space in the lean-to for your mule, and you can sleep by the fire if you're willing to keep it fed through the night." "That's more than generous, Clara. I'm grateful." "Don't be grateful yet," she said with a weak smile. "That wood you mentioned, it's not going to last 3 days. More like 1, maybe 2 if I'm careful. And I can't split what's left out there fast enough to keep ahead of what we're burning." Jed looked around the cabin with new eyes, taking in details he'd missed in his initial assessment. The drip pans catching water from the leaking roof, the gap under the door where cold air flowed in steadily, the meager supplies visible on the shelves, enough for one person to survive the winter perhaps, but not with any margin for error. "Clara," he said carefully, "how long since you've had a proper meal?" "I eat," she said defensively. "That's not what I asked." She was quiet again, and this time Jed could see her internal struggle. Pride warring with necessity, the independence she'd fought to maintain since her husband's death, crashing against the simple reality that she was failing. "I've been careful with the supplies," she finally admitted. "The baby needs me to stay strong, but if I eat too much now, there won't be enough to last until spring." Jed felt something twist in his chest, anger at a world that could leave. A pregnant woman to face such choices alone. And something else, something that felt dangerously close to protective instinct. He'd spent years avoiding exactly this kind of entanglement, the sort of situation where another person's welfare became his responsibility. But looking at Clara now, seeing the stubborn tilt of her chin even as exhaustion weighed down her shoulders, he knew he couldn't ride away when the storm passed. "Clara," he said, moving closer to the fire and adding another piece of wood from the dwindling pile beside the hearth. "I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer." "All right. What if I stayed? Not just until the storm passes, but through the winter. I could split your wood, make repairs to the cabin, hunt game to stretch your supplies. I don't eat much, and I can sleep anywhere. In return, I'd have a roof over my head and hot meals, which is more than I've had in months." Clara stared at him, as if he'd suggested they fly to the moon. "You don't even know me." "No, but I know enough. I know you're trying to survive alone in country that doesn't forgive mistakes. I know you're willing to work yourself to death rather than give up on what your husband built. And I know that baby you're carrying deserves a chance to be born into something better than a cold cabin with no firewood." "People would talk," Clara said weakly. "A woman and a man living together without being married. The neighbors would—" "What? Neighbors?" Jed asked gently. "Clara, the nearest folks are miles away and they're snowed in same as everyone else. Come spring, if you want me gone, I'll go. But right now, in this storm, with winter barely started, you need help. And He paused, surprised by his own honesty. "I need to be useful to somebody." Clara was crying now, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Not the desperate tears of hysteria, but the quiet weeping of someone finally allowing herself to feel the weight of what she'd been carrying alone. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've been so careful, so determined to prove I could manage on my own. Thomas always said I was the strongest person he knew, and I didn't want to prove him wrong." "Nothing weak about accepting help when you need it," Jed said. "Your husband sounds like he was a practical man. He'd want you and the baby to survive, whatever it took." Outside, the wind howled with renewed fury, rattling the cabin's windows and sending fresh drafts through the gaps around the door. The fire flickered, and Jed added another piece of wood, noting how quickly their small store was disappearing. "All right," Clara said suddenly, her voice steadier than it had been since he'd found her in the snow. "All right, Jedediah Boone. You can stay, but there are rules. I'd expect nothing less. You sleep on the floor by the fire. You do your own washing and mending. You pull your weight with the work, but you don't presume to make decisions about this place without asking me first. And if I tell you to leave, you go. No arguments, no questions." "Agreed," Jed said, and meant it. "And one more thing," Clara added, her autumn leaf eyes meeting his directly. "You tell me true. Why are you really doing this? A drifter doesn't stop his wandering for a pregnant stranger without a reason." Jed considered lying, giving her some comfortable fiction about Christian charity or simple human decency. But something in her gaze demanded honesty, and after years of running from his own truth, he found himself too tired to keep up the pretense. "Because I've been empty for a long time," he said. "Because I've done things I'm not proud of and haven't. Done things I should have. Because when I saw you fall in that snow, something in me recognized something in you, and walking away would have killed what's left of the man I used to be." Clara nodded slowly, as if his answer had satisfied some question she hadn't known how to ask. "Then welcome to the Larkins homestead, Jed Boone," she said. "I hope we both survive what we've just started." Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the small cabin, two lonely souls had found their way to an understanding that would change both their lives forever. The first morning dawned grey and bitter, with the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. Jed woke to the sound of Clara moving carefully around the cabin, trying not to wake him as she stoked the fire back to life. He'd slept better than he had in months, despite the hard floor and thin blanket she'd given him. There was something to be said for sleeping in a place where he was welcome, even temporarily. "Morning," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her. "Good morning," Clara replied, glancing over her shoulder. "I was trying not to wake you. I know you must be tired from traveling in that weather." "I'm used to early mornings," Jed said, rolling to his feet with the practiced ease of a man who'd slept rough more often than not. "What needs doing first?" Clara paused in her fire tending, and Jed could see her working through the adjustment of having another person in her space. "Well, I usually check on the animals first. There's just the cow and a few chickens, but they'll need water and feed." "I'll tend to that," Jed offered, "after I see to Mercy. She's probably wondering why we're still here." The lean-to attached to the back of the cabin was sturdily built, but showed signs of the same settling issues as the main structure. Mercy stood companionably next to a brown milk cow that regarded Jed with placid curiosity. 3 chickens roosted on a beam overhead, fluffed against the cold, but apparently healthy enough. As Jed worked, breaking ice on the water trough, forking hay from the small store Thomas had laid up, checking that the animals had weathered the storm without injury, he found himself cataloguing everything that needed attention. The lean-to's roof sagged in one corner where snow had accumulated. Several boards in the walls had worked loose, allowing drafts that would only get worse as winter progressed. The fence around the small paddock tilted at dangerous angles, held up more by habit than structural integrity. It was the work of weeks, maybe months, to set everything right, but it was work he knew how to do, work that would matter come spring. For the first time since the buffalo herds had disappeared, Jed felt the familiar satisfaction of planning meaningful labor. When he returned to the cabin with a pail of fresh milk and 3 eggs, Clara had managed to coax their meager fire into something resembling warmth. She looked better this morning, less drawn, though still obviously exhausted. Pregnancy was hard enough without the stress of survival weighing on every decision. "This cow's got a good constitution," Jed reported, setting the milk on the table. "But that lean-to needs work before the next big storm. Some of the boards have come loose, and there's a spot where the roof's starting to sag." Clara nodded, adding the eggs to a pan that was already warming on the fire. "Thomas meant to fix that last summer, but he spent most of his time working on the cabin itself. He said we'd have years to make improvements." Her voice caught slightly on the last words. "It's good work what he did," Jed said carefully. "Solid foundation, straight walls. A man can tell when a place is built with care." "He wanted it to be perfect for the baby," Clara said, her hand moving instinctively to her belly. "He had such plans. Wanted to add another room, maybe build a proper barn instead of just the lean-to. He talked about planting an orchard, putting in a bigger garden. He saw it all so clearly." Jed heard the grief in her voice, but also something else. A determination to honor those dreams, even if she had to carry them alone. "Those are good plans," he said. "Practical. This land could support all of that, given time and work." Clara glanced at him sharply. "You think so? You're not just saying that to be kind." "I'm not much for saying things I don't mean," Jed replied. "Honestly, this valley's got good water, decent soil, shelter from the worst winds. Your husband chose well. It would be a shame to let it go back to wilderness for lack of hands to work it." They ate breakfast in comfortable silence, eggs scrambled with a bit of the preserved pork Clara had been hoarding, cornbread that was somewhat stale but still filling. Jed noticed that Clara served herself a smaller portion than she gave him, and he made a mental note to address that issue soon. A pregnant woman needed proper nutrition, and from the look of her, she'd been sacrificing her own needs for too long. After breakfast, Jed excused himself to survey the woodpile and the damage from yesterday's storm. What he found was worse than he'd feared. Clara hadn't been exaggerating. There was perhaps a day and a half of split wood remaining, and the pile of unsplit logs was significantly smaller than it should have been for a winter this young. Moreover, several of the logs were green wood that would smoke more than burn, the kind of fuel that spoke of desperation rather than planning. The axe Thomas had used lay where Clara had dropped it yesterday, its handle worn smooth by years of use. Jed hefted it, testing its weight and balance. It was a good tool, well maintained, but far too heavy for a woman in Clara's condition to wield effectively. He'd seen the evidence of her struggles in her blistered hands, in the improperly split pieces that littered the ground around the chopping block. Jed spent the morning splitting wood with steady, practiced strokes. It felt good to use his body for something constructive, to see the pile of ready fuel growing with each swing of the axe. He'd always been strong. Years of physical labor had built muscles that served him well, and the rhythmic work left his mind free to think. The situation was more precarious than Clara probably realized. Her supplies were adequate for one person living carefully, but winter was far from over, and pregnancy would increase her caloric needs as the baby grew. The cabin needed repairs that couldn't wait for spring. The leaking roof would cause real damage if left untended, and the gaps around the door and windows were bleeding heat they couldn't afford to lose. But beyond the practical concerns, Jed found himself thinking about Clara herself. There was something in her careful movements, her measured words, that spoke of a woman holding herself together through sheer force of will. She'd been strong for so long that she'd forgotten it was acceptable to be vulnerable, to need help, to admit that some burdens were too heavy to carry alone. When he returned to the cabin for the midday meal, Clara was mending a shirt by the window, taking advantage of what little daylight filtered through the clouds. She looked up as he entered, and Jed saw her surprise at the quantity of wood he'd managed to split. "You've been busy," she observed. "Good, honest work," Jed replied, "though we're going to need more logs before too long. Is there a woodlot on the property, or do you buy from someone in town?" "Thomas cut most of our wood from the grove up the hill," Clara said, setting down her mending, "but I can't manage the crosscut saw alone, and I don't have a horse to drag the logs back to the cabin." Jed nodded, filing away another item for his growing mental list. "Mercy's stronger than she looks. Not much for riding anymore, but she can pull a sled well enough. We'll manage." "We?" Clara asked, and there was something tentative in her voice, as if she still couldn't quite believe in the partnership he'd offered. "If you'll have me," Jed said simply. "I meant what I said yesterday, Clara. I'm not going anywhere until spring, not unless you ask me to leave." Clara was quiet for a moment, her needle suspended over the fabric in her lap. "It's been so long since I could say we about anything," she finally admitted. "Since Thomas died, every decision has been mine alone, every problem mine to solve. I'd forgotten what it felt like to share the load." "Gets easier with practice," Jed said, settling into the chair across from her. "Though I suspect you've been carrying more than your share for a while now." "What do you mean?" "Just that you've got the look of someone who's been the strong one for so long, she's forgotten how to let anyone else help. Takes a particular kind of strength to survive what you've been through, but it takes a different kind to accept that you don't have to survive it alone." Clara's hands stilled on her mending, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Thomas used to say something similar. He said I was so determined to prove I was tough enough for frontier life that I sometimes forgot. It was acceptable to lean on him. Sounds like a wise man, he was, and he'd probably tell me to stop being so stubborn about accepting your help." "Probably," Jed agreed with a small smile, "but you'll get there in your own time. No rush." That afternoon, While Clara rested, he'd noticed her moving more slowly as the day progressed, fatigue weighing heavy on her shoulders. Jed made his way up the hill to examine the woodlot Thomas had mentioned. What he found was encouraging. A healthy stand of mixed timber with plenty of deadfall suitable for cutting. More importantly, he found evidence of Thomas's planning. Trees marked for selective harvest, a rough trail that would allow them to drag logs back to the cabin. The work would be hard, especially alone, but it was doable. And there was something deeply satisfying about the prospect of spending his winter in this kind of labor, cutting fuel to keep Clara warm, making repairs to preserve what Thomas had built, preparing for the birth of a child who would grow up in this place. As the short winter day faded toward evening, Jed found himself looking forward to the simple domestic rhythm they were already establishing. Supper by the fire, quiet conversation, the comfortable presence of another person sharing his space. It was a kind of contentment he hadn't experienced in years, and it made him realize just how empty his wandering life had become. When he returned to the cabin as darkness was falling, Clara was preparing a modest supper of beans and salt pork. She looked up as he entered, and Jed saw something in her expression that hadn't been there the day before. A tentative trust, the beginning of hope that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't facing the winter alone anymore. "How did you find the woodlot?" she asked. "Good timber, well planned. Your husband knew what he was about. We'll have plenty of fuel once I get a system organized for cutting and hauling." "When you say we," Clara began, then stopped herself. "I mean we," Jed said firmly. "You and me and that baby you're carrying. We're going to make it through this winter, Clara, all of us, together." For the first time since he'd found her collapsed in the snow, Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and transformed her entire face. "Together," she repeated, as if testing the sound of the word. "I think I'd like that." A week passed before Clara began to truly trust that Jedediah Boone would still be there when she woke each morning. 7 days of watching him tend the animals without being asked, split wood until the pile grew respectable again, and repair the loose boards. In the lean-to with careful precision, 7 nights of falling asleep to the steady rhythm of his breathing by the fire, a sound that somehow made the cabin feel less like a trap and more like a shelter. It was on the 8th morning that Clara finally allowed herself to sleep past dawn, trusting that someone else would tend the fire, would check on the cow, would handle the 100 small tasks that had fallen to her alone for so long. When she woke to the smell of coffee and the sound of eggs crackling in the pan, she felt something she'd almost forgotten existed, the luxury of being cared for. "You should have woken me," she said, pushing herself upright with some difficulty. The baby seemed to grow heavier each day, shifting her balance and making simple movements an effort. "No need," Jed replied, not turning from the fire where he was tending their breakfast. "You were sleeping peaceful, and the morning chores are getting to be routine now. Besides, you were up half the night with that cough." Clara touched her throat reflexively. She'd been fighting a cold for several days. Nothing serious, but annoying enough to disturb her rest. "It's nothing to worry about, just the change in weather." "Maybe so," Jed said, finally turning to look at her with those serious grey eyes. "But you're eating for 2 now, and working harder than you should be. Your body's telling you to rest more, and it might be wise to listen." There was no judgment in his voice, no implication that she was weak or failing, just practical concern, the kind a good neighbor might express, or a brother who cared about her welfare. It was that absence of romantic presumption that had made it possible for Clara to begin trusting him, she realized. Jed treated her with the respect due to a woman managing her own life, while offering the kind of support she desperately needed. Over breakfast, they fell into the easy conversation that had become their morning ritual. Jed would report on the animals and the state of their supplies. Clara would share her plans for the day's domestic work, and together they would discuss what needed attention around the homestead. It was a partnership born of necessity, but Clara was beginning to suspect it was becoming something more substantial, a genuine friendship built on mutual respect and shared purpose. "I've been thinking about the roof," Jed said, mopping up the last of his eggs with a piece of cornbread. "Those leaks are only going to get worse when the spring thaw comes. If I can get up there on a clear day, I should be able to patch the worst spots." "Is it safe to do that work in winter?" Clara asked. "Safe enough if I'm careful. The snow's not too deep yet, and those leaks are letting in cold air along with water. We'd both sleep better knowing the roof is sound." Clara nodded, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of Jed climbing around on the slippery roof. When had she started worrying about his safety? When had his welfare become entangled with her own peace of mind? "There's something else I wanted to discuss," Jed continued, his tone becoming more serious. "Your supplies, what about them? Clara, you've got enough food to see one person through the winter if they're careful, but you're pregnant, which means you need more calories than you're allowing yourself, and now there are two of us drawing on those stores. We need to either stretch what we have or find ways to supplement it." Clara felt her defensive instincts rise. "I've been managing fine on my own." "Have you?" Jed asked gently. "When's the last time you had a full meal without counting every bite? When's the last time you didn't go to bed a little hungry?" The quiet questions hit their mark because they were true. Clara had been rationing her food so carefully that hunger had become a constant companion, a gnawing reminder of how precarious her situation really was. She told herself it was temporary, that she could endure anything until spring, but the baby's increasing demands on her body were making that calculation more difficult every day. "What are you suggesting?" she asked finally. "Hunting, for one thing. I'm a decent shot, and there's game in these hills. Deer, rabbit, maybe some grouse if we're lucky. Fresh meat would stretch your salt pork considerably. I don't want you taking unnecessary risks." "Clara," Jed said, leaning forward slightly, "I spent years tracking buffalo across open plains with hostile tribes and competing hunters. A few rabbits in familiar territory aren't going to be the death of me." She had to smile at that. "You're right, of course. I suppose I've gotten so used to thinking of survival as something I have to manage alone that I forget other people might actually be capable of helping." "That's understandable," Jed said, "but you're not alone anymore, at least not until spring." The qualifications stung a little, though Clara couldn't say why. She'd been the one to insist their arrangement was temporary after all. But somehow, over the past week, she'd begun to imagine what it might be like to have a permanent partner in this venture. Someone to share not just the work, but the dreams Thomas had carried for this place. That afternoon, while Jed worked on the roof repairs, Clara found herself drawn to the wooden chest where she kept her most precious possessions. Among them was a quilt her mother had pieced together as a wedding gift, a complex pattern in blues and golds that had taken the better part of 2 years to complete. Clara had been saving it for the baby, planning to use it in the cradle Thomas had started building before his illness took hold. She pulled the quilt from the chest and spread it across her lap, running her fingers over the careful stitches, the fabric squares that told the story of her mother's patient love. Each piece had been chosen for its quality and beauty, saved from worn-out dresses and household linens, transformed into something that would last for generations. That's what she wanted for this place, Clara realized. Not just survival, but transformation. She wanted to take what Thomas had begun and build something beautiful from it, something worthy of the child she carried and the life she was trying to create. But she was beginning to understand that such dreams required more than one person's determination. When Jed climbed down from the roof near sunset, his clothes damp with melted snow, but his expression satisfied, Clara met him at the door with a warm cup of coffee and a question that surprised them both. "Jed," she said, "what did you dream about when you were younger? Before the buffalo hunting, before the drifting, what did you want your life to look like?" He paused in the act of removing his wet boots, clearly taken aback by the personal question. They'd talked about practical matters, shared stories about their past experiences, but they hadn't ventured into the territory of hopes and dreams. "That's a question I haven't thought about in a long time," he said finally. "Think about it now." Jed settled into the chair across from her, cradling the warm cup in his hands. "I used to think about having a place of my own," he said slowly. "Nothing grand, just a piece of land where I could build something that would last, maybe run some cattle, grow enough crops to feed my family, live quiet and honest." What happened to that dream? Life, I suppose. After the war, everything seemed uncertain. The buffalo herds were easy money, and I told myself I'd do it for a few years, save up enough to buy land, but the years kept passing, and somewhere along the way I stopped believing I deserved that kind of peace. Why? Jed was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. Because I took too much from the world without giving anything back. Because I watched something beautiful disappear and played a part in its destruction. Because I convinced myself that men like me don't get second chances at peaceful lives. Clara studied his profile, seeing the regret that lined his face, the weariness that spoke of carrying guilt for too long. "Thomas used to say that a man's past doesn't have to determine his future," she said softly. "He said every day was a chance to choose who you wanted to be." Your husband sounds like he was. A philosopher as well as a homesteader. He was practical, Clara corrected. He knew that dwelling on mistakes you couldn't change was just another way of avoiding the work you could do today. Jed turned to look at her then, something shifting in his expression. "Is that why you're asking? Because you see me dwelling instead of working?" "No," Clara said, surprised by her own honesty. "I'm asking because I want to know if the man sitting at my table still has dreams worth building toward. Because I think this place could be what you used to imagine, if you wanted it to be." The words hung between them, more significant than Clara had intended when she'd started the conversation. She'd meant to offer encouragement, perhaps to understand better the man who'd become so essential to her daily existence. She hadn't meant to suggest a future that extended beyond spring. "Clara," Jed said carefully, "you don't know what you're saying." "Don't I? You're grieving and you're scared and you're grateful for help when you needed it most. But that's not the same as wanting to bind your life to a drifter who owns nothing but a worn-out mule and a pile of regrets." Clara felt a spark of anger at his presumption. "Don't tell me what I'm feeling, Jedediah Boone. I'm not some fragile creature who can't tell the difference between gratitude and genuine affection. I'm a grown woman who's been making her own decisions for years." "I didn't mean, yes, you did," Clara interrupted. "You meant that I couldn't possibly see anything worthwhile in you, couldn't possibly want your company for reasons that have nothing to do with necessity. Well, let me tell you something. I've had a week to watch you work, to see how you treat my animals and my home and me. I've seen your patience and your skill and your fundamental decency, and if I'm beginning to think this arrangement could be more than temporary, that's my choice to make." Jed stared at her, clearly struggling with something he couldn't quite voice. "Clara, what are you asking me?" "I'm asking if you'd consider staying," she said simply. "Not just until spring, but permanently, as my partner in this place, in raising this child, in building the life Thomas started here. Are you proposing to me?" The blunt question made Clara laugh, despite the tension of the moment. "I suppose I am, in a roundabout way, though it's not very romantic, is it?" "It's the most romantic thing anyone's ever said to me," Jed replied quietly. "But Clara, you need to think about what you're offering. Marriage to a man with no property, no prospects beyond his willingness to work. A man who's made more mistakes than successes. Are you sure that's what you want for yourself and your child?" Clara looked at him, really looked, seeing past the worn clothes and weather-beaten face to the man underneath. A man who'd stopped everything to help a stranger, who'd worked without complaint to keep her warm and fed, who'd never once presumed on her gratitude or made her feel obligated beyond what she freely chose to give. "I'm sure," she said. "The question is whether you want the same thing." Jed was quiet for so long that Clara began to fear she'd misjudged everything, that she'd mistaken his kindness for something deeper and driven him away with her presumption. But when he finally spoke, his voice was thick with an emotion she Couldn't quite name. I want it more than I've wanted anything in my life, he said. But I need you to be certain, Clara. Once I say yes, once I commit to this place and to you, I'm not leaving, not for any reason. You'd be stuck with me for better or worse, and I need to know you're prepared for that. Clara reached across the space between their chairs and took his work-roughened hand in hers. I'm prepared, she said. Are you? Jed lifted their joined hands and kissed her knuckles gently, a gesture so tender it brought tears to her eyes. Yes, he said simply. Yes, Clara Larkins, I'll marry you, and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the chance you're giving me. Outside, the wind was picking up again, promising another storm before morning. But inside the small cabin, two hearts that had been broken by loss and loneliness began to beat in a rhythm that spoke of hope, of partnership, of love that had grown from shared purpose into something strong enough to last a lifetime. The blizzard that struck 3 days after their quiet engagement was unlike anything Clara had experienced in her 2 years on the homestead. It came down from Canada with a vengeance that seemed personal, driving snow horizontally across the valley and piling drifts against the cabin walls until the windows were half buried. For 36 hours, the world outside ceased to exist, reduced to a howling white void that made even a trip to the lean-to treacherous. But Clara found herself oddly peaceful as she and Jed waited out nature's fury. There was something profoundly comforting about being storm-bound with someone she trusted, about knowing that the work of survival was shared between them. When the wind rattled the windows or found a new crack to exploit, Jed would quietly rise to add wood to the fire or check that their makeshift weather stripping was holding. When Clara grew restless with confinement, he would tell stories of his buffalo hunting days, carefully edited tales that emphasized the grandeur of the open plains rather than the violence of the work. It was during the second night of the storm, as they sat by the fire listening to the wind's relentless assault, that Clara finally worked up the courage to address the practicalities of their engagement. "We should talk about the ceremony," she said, her voice barely audible above the storm. Jed looked up from the harness leather he was mending, another of those small tasks that filled the long winter hours. "What kind of ceremony did you have in mind?" "I don't know," Clara admitted. "I keep thinking about what people will say, how we'll explain ourselves when spring comes." "Does it matter what people say?" "It shouldn't," Clara said. "But I lived in town before I married Thomas. I know how quickly gossip spreads, how quickly a woman's reputation can be destroyed by the wrong kind of speculation." Jed set down his work and gave her his full attention. "Clara, are you having second thoughts?" "No," she said quickly. "No, I'm not. I want this, want us, but I also want to do things properly, in a way that protects the baby from any taint of scandal." "Then we'll do it properly," Jed said simply. "Soon as this storm clears, we'll make our way to town and find a preacher. If the roads are too bad for that, we'll send word to old Henrik and see if he knows anyone who might perform. The service here." Clara felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. "You make it sound so simple." "It is simple. Two people who care about each other, making promises in front of God and witnesses. The rest is just ceremony." "Is that really how you see it? As simple as that?" Jed was quiet for a moment, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Clara, I've seen enough of the world to know that most things worth having are complicated. But the decision to love someone, to commit yourself to their welfare, that's about as simple and straightforward as human choices get." The word love hung between them like a bridge neither had quite dared to cross before. They talked about partnership, about building a life together, about the practical benefits of their arrangement. But this was the first time either had spoken directly about the emotions that had been growing alongside their daily intimacy. "Do you?" Clara asked softly. "Love me, I mean." "Yes," Jed said without hesitation. "I know it's soon, and I know our circumstances aren't exactly conventional. But yes, I love your strength and your stubbornness and the way you refuse to give up on things that matter to you. I love watching you plan for this baby, seeing how your face lights up when you talk about the future. I love the sound of your voice in the morning, and the way you make this cabin feel like home." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of relief rather than sadness. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't expect to, didn't think I was ready to feel that way about anyone again. But you've been so patient with me, so careful not to push for more than I was ready to give. You've made me remember what it feels like to be cherished." "You are cherished," Jed said, moving from his chair to kneel beside hers. "You and the baby both. Whatever happens, Clara, whatever challenges we face, that won't change." She reached out to touch his face, marveling at the tenderness in his weathered features. "Thomas used to say that love was something you chose every day, not just something you fell into. I choose you, Jed. Every day from now on, I choose you." He caught her hand and pressed it more firmly against his cheek. "And I choose you. Both of you." The baby chose that moment to deliver a particularly vigorous kick, and Clara laughed as she saw Jed's eyes widen with surprise and wonder. "Getting stronger every day," she said. "I think this little one is going to be a force to be reckoned with." "Gets that from the mother," Jed said with a smile. Does it hurt when the baby moves like that?" "Sometimes it's uncomfortable," Clara admitted, "but mostly it's reassuring. It means everything is progressing as it should." Jed looked thoughtful. "Clara, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be honest with me." "All right. Are you afraid? About the birth, I mean. About what might happen when your time comes." Clara had been dreading this conversation, but she knew it couldn't be avoided forever. "Yes," she said simply, "I'm terrified. Because you'll be alone. Because there's no doctor nearby. That's part of it," Clara said. "But it's more than that. My mother, she had trouble with births, lost 3 babies before me, and I was her only child who lived past infancy. What if I have the same problems? What if something goes wrong and there's no one who knows what to do?" Jed was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the weight of her fears. "Has the baby been moving normally, growing as it should?" "I think so. I don't have much to compare it to, but everything feels right, if that makes sense." "It does. And Clara, you're not alone. I may not be a doctor, but I've helped with births before. Cattle, horses, even a few human babies when I was younger and still living near family. It's not the same as having proper medical care, but it's not nothing either." "You've delivered babies 3 times, Jed said. "My sister's children back in Kansas. The doctor couldn't make it through a flood, so I had to help. Scared me half to death each time, but all 3 babies came through fine." Clara felt a wave of relief so strong it made her dizzy. She'd been so focused on the dangers, so frightened by stories of women who died in childbirth, that she'd almost convinced herself she was facing those risks alone. But Jed's quiet competence, his matter-of-fact approach to problems, gave her hope that maybe, just maybe, everything would be all right. "Will you tell me about it?" she asked. "What to expect, what to prepare for?" "Of course, though I should warn you, it's not a process that can be rushed or controlled. Babies come when they're ready, and the best thing we can do is be prepared and trust that nature knows what it's about." They talked until late that night, Jed sharing what he knew about the stages of labor, the supplies they would need, the signs that indicated when birth was imminent. It wasn't a romantic conversation by any conventional measure, but Clara found it deeply intimate. This sharing of knowledge and fears, this practical planning for the most important event of her life. When they finally settled down to sleep, Clara lay listening to the storm outside and thinking about how much her life had changed in just 2 weeks. She'd gone from facing winter alone to planning a marriage, from dreading her child's birth to having a partner who would see her through it. The future that had seemed so bleak and uncertain now held promise, possibility, the kind of hope she'd thought died with Thomas. The storm finally blew itself out near dawn of the 3rd day, leaving behind a world transformed by snow. Drifts reached nearly to the cabin's eaves, and the path to the lean-to was completely obliterated, but the sun shone for the first time in days, turning the snow-covered landscape into something magical and pristine. were well and truly snowed. Jed observed, surveying the scene from the cabin door. It'll be days before we can dig out enough to travel anywhere. Does that worry you? Clara asked. No, Jed said, closing the door against the cold and turning back to her with a smile. Gives us time to plan our wedding properly. And besides, I can't think of anywhere else I'd rather be snowed in. Clara smiled back, her hand resting on her growing belly, where the baby stirred restlessly, as if sensing the change in its mother's mood. Outside, the world was buried under winter's fury, but inside their small cabin, love was taking root and growing stronger with each passing day. Neither can I, she said softly. Neither can I. As if summoned by their contentment, a new sound reached them through the walls, the distant lowing of cattle in distress. Jed's expression immediately shifted from relaxed to alert. That's not our cow, he said, reaching for his coat. Sounds like someone's lost stock in the storm. Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold air seeping through the door. Lost cattle meant people in trouble, possibly desperate people who might view their isolated cabin as an opportunity rather than a refuge. And with the snow, this deep help was still days away. Jed, she said quietly, be careful. He paused in his preparations, hearing the fear in her voice. I will be. But Clara, if someone's stock got loose in that storm, it means they're probably in as much trouble as we were before I showed up. We can't just ignore it. She knew he was right. Knew that frontier survival depended on neighbors helping neighbors, even when resources were scarce. But something about the timing made her uneasy. The storm had ended barely an hour ago, yet already there were cattle wandering loose near their cabin. Take the rifle, she said, and if anything seems wrong, anything at all, you come back here immediately. Jed nodded, understanding her concern even if he didn't entirely share it. He checked the rifle's load, kissed Clara's forehead gently, and stepped out into the snow-bright morning. Clara watched from the window as he made his way toward the sound of the cattle, his figure dark against the white landscape. Everything looked peaceful, almost idyllic, but she couldn't shake the feeling that their quiet happiness was about to be tested by forces beyond their control. The cattle, it turned out, belonged to the Miller family, the same neighbors Clara had mentioned, as living 15 miles east. What Jed found, when he followed the sound of their distressed lowing, was a scene that spoke of desperation and poor planning. 3 head of cattle, thin and exhausted, had somehow broken free from their winter shelter and wandered through the storm until they'd fetched up against the natural windbreak behind Clara's cabin. But it wasn't the lost cattle that made Jed's hand tighten on his rifle. It was the man who came stumbling through the snow 20 minutes later, calling for his missing stock, with the kind of panic that spoke of a family's survival hanging in the balance. Ray Miller was a man Jed had never met, but his reputation in the territory was well known. A hard worker but a poor planner, Miller had arrived in Montana 3 years ago with grand dreams and insufficient capital. His homestead was marginal land that should never have been chosen for cattle ranching, and his family, a wife and 2 young children, lived perpetually on the edge of disaster. Thank God, Miller gasped when he spotted Jed approaching with the wayward cattle. I've been tracking them since before dawn. When they broke out during the storm, I thought we'd lost them for good. They're in decent shape, Jed replied carefully, studying Miller's gaunt face and the desperation in his eyes. But they're weak from traveling in the cold. You'll want to get them home and fed as soon as possible. Home, Miller laughed bitterly. That's assuming there's still a home to go to. The storm took out half our barn roof, and we lost most of our hay to wind and snow. These 3 cattle are all we've got left, and if I can't get them through the winter— He didn't finish the sentence, but Jed understood. Without livestock, the Miller family had no means of income, no way to rebuild from this latest setback, and with 2 small children depending on them, the stakes were life and death. There might be something we can do, Jed found himself saying, though he knew Clara wouldn't appreciate him making decisions about their resources without consulting her first. My Mrs. Larkins and I have a small pasture that's somewhat sheltered, We could house your cattle until you get your barn repaired." Miller's face transformed with hope, so naked it was painful to witness. "You do that, even though we're not close neighbors?" "Neighbors help neighbors," Jed replied, echoing the frontier code that had kept communities alive in this harsh country. "But you'll need to talk to Mrs. Larkins about the details. It's her land, her decision." When they reached the cabin, Clara was waiting by the door with an expression that mixed relief at Jed's safe return with apprehension about what new complications he might be bringing home. Jed made quick introductions and explained the situation while Miller stood awkwardly in the snow, clearly torn between hope and the humiliation of needing charity. "Mr. Miller," Clara said after hearing the story, "please, come inside where it's warm. We can discuss this properly over coffee." The next hour revealed the full extent of the Miller family's crisis. Ray's wife, Sarah, was pregnant with their third child, due sometime in early spring. Their two boys, ages 4 and 6, had been fighting a persistent cough that wouldn't clear up in their drafty, inadequately heated cabin. The storm had been the final blow to a family already struggling to survive their first Montana winter. "I know we don't have much to offer in return," Miller said, his pride clearly warring with necessity, "but I'm handy with tools. And Sarah's a fine cook and seamstress. We could work off any debt." "Let's not talk about debt," Clara interrupted gently. "Let's talk about what makes sense for everyone involved." What they worked out was a partnership that benefited both families. The Miller cattle would winter in Clara's sheltered pasture, sharing hay with her cow and reducing the burden on both herds. In return, Ray would help Jed with the heavy work around the homestead, cutting firewood, making repairs, preparing for spring planting. Sarah Miller, despite her own pregnancy, would assist Clara as her time approached, providing the experienced female presence that frontier births desperately needed. "It's not charity," Clara explained when Miller continued to protest the arrangement's generosity. "It's practical cooperation. I need help with this baby, you need shelter for your cattle, and both our men need more hands for the work that's coming. We're all better off working together." After Miller left to retrieve his family and what possessions they could transport through the snow, Clara and Jed found themselves facing the reality of what they'd just committed to. Their quiet winter partnership was about to become a crowded household with children, extra mouths to feed, and the complex dynamics that came with multiple families sharing close quarters. "Are you having second thoughts?" Clara asked, watching Jed bank the fire for what might be their last evening alone. "For months. About the Millers, no. About us, never." He moved to sit beside her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. "Though I admit I hadn't expected to start our marriage with quite so much company." "Sarah Miller has delivered 3 babies," Clara pointed out. "That experience could make the difference between life and death when my time comes." "True, and Ray knows this country better than I do. His help could mean the difference between just surviving the winter and actually improving the homestead." They were both quiet for a moment, contemplating the changes coming with dawn. Then Clara spoke the thought that had been nagging at her since Miller's arrival. "Jed, what if we're taking on more than we can handle? What if we don't have enough supplies to see 5 adults and 2 children through the rest of winter?" It was a reasonable fear. Their stores had been calculated for 2 people, and while the Millers would contribute what they could, it wouldn't be enough to offset the increased consumption. They would need to be creative, resourceful, and perhaps lucky to avoid hunger before spring. "Then we'll be creative," Jed said simply. "Hunt more, preserve more, stretch everything further. People have survived worse with less. And if someone gets sick, if the children's cough spreads, or if Sarah has complications with her pregnancy, then we'll deal with that too." Jed took her hand, feeling the tension in her fingers. "Clara, I know this feels overwhelming, but think about what you just did. You looked at a family in crisis and found a way to help that also helps us. That's not the action of someone who can't handle challenges." Clara leaned against his shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm being naive, thinking we can make all this work. The marriage, the babies, the homestead. It's so much to juggle. Maybe, but naive isn't the word I'd use. Hopeful, perhaps. Determined. Willing to believe that people can build something good together if they're willing to work for it." "Is that what you believe?" "It's what I'm learning to believe," Jed replied honestly. "Before I met you, I thought the best a man like me could hope for was to do less harm than good. Now I'm starting to think maybe I can actually contribute something worthwhile to the world." That night, as they lay in their separate beds for what might be the last time for months, Clara found herself thinking about the strange turns life could take. 3 weeks ago, she'd been facing winter alone, terrified and overwhelmed. Now she was preparing for marriage, expecting a child, and opening her home to neighbors in need. It was either the wisest decision she'd ever made or the most foolish, and she wouldn't know which until spring revealed the consequences. But as she listened to Jed's steady breathing and felt the baby moving restlessly in her womb, Clara felt something she hadn't experienced since Thomas's death, a sense of belonging to something larger than her own survival. She was part of a community now, however small and unconventional. She had people depending on her and people she could depend on in return. The Miller family arrived 2 days later in a wagon loaded with their meager possessions and the 3 cattle that represented their only remaining wealth. Sarah Miller was a small, determined woman with prematurely gray hair and hands that never stopped moving. Mending, organizing, cooking, tending her children with the efficiency of someone accustomed to making much from little. Her boys, Jimmy and Thomas, named for his grandfather, Sarah explained with a sad smile, were initially shy around the strangers who'd opened their home. But they quickly warmed to Jed, who treated them with the same patient respect he showed the adults, and to Clara, who let them help with small chores that made them feel useful rather than burdensome. The cabin, which had felt spacious with just Clara and Jed, became decidedly cozy with 7 people sharing the single room. They worked out a system of curtains and strategic furniture placement that provided some privacy, but there was no escaping the reality that they were all intimately acquainted with each other's habits, moods, and personal quirks. What surprised Clara was how quickly they adapted, how naturally the group fell into rhythms that maximized efficiency while minimizing friction. Sarah took over much of the cooking, freeing Clara to rest more as her pregnancy progressed. Ray and Jed formed an effective team for the outdoor work, accomplishing more together than either could have managed alone. The children, after an initial period of testing boundaries, settled into the routine of shared chores and winter lessons by the fire. But it was the quiet conversations between the women that Clara treasured most. Sarah had experience Clara lacked, not just with childbirth and child-rearing, but with the particular challenges of frontier life. She shared practical knowledge about everything from treating common illnesses with available remedies to preserving food without proper root cellars. "The first winter is always the hardest," Sarah confided one evening, as they worked together on mending clothes. "Ray and I nearly starved our first year in Wyoming before we learned to plan better. But you and Jed, you're thinking ahead, making smart choices. This arrangement we've worked out, it's going to save all our lives." "I hope so," Clara replied. "Sometimes I worry we're trying to do too much, take care of too many people." "Clara, let me tell you something I learned the hard way," Sarah said, setting down her needle to give her full attention. "Out here, trying to go it alone is what kills people. The families that survive are the ones that figure out how to work together, how to share the load when times get tough. What you and Jed are doing, it's not charity, it's community, and community is what's going to see all of us through to spring." That night, as Clara settled into her bed, with Sarah's words echoing in her mind, she felt a deep sense of gratitude for the unexpected turns her life had taken. Yes, their situation was complex and challenging. Yes, there were risks in opening their home to virtual strangers. But there was also strength in numbers, wisdom in shared experience, and a kind of joy in being part of something larger than individual survival. Outside, another storm was building, the wind picking up and the temperature dropping toward dangerous levels. But inside the crowded cabin, 5 adults and 2 children were warm, fed, and surrounded by the kind of mutual support that made harsh winters survivable. As Clara drifted toward sleep, she felt the baby kick strongly against her ribs, a deep reminder that soon their small community would grow by one more member. The thought no longer terrified her as it once had. With Sarah's experienced hands to guide the birth and Jed's steady presence to anchor her courage, Clara was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, everything was going to work out fine. The last thing she heard before sleep claimed her was the soft murmur of Jed and Ray planning the next day's work, their voices mixing with the wind outside in a symphony of purpose and partnership that spoke of hope rather than mere survival. The knock came on a Tuesday morning in late February, sharp and authoritative, against the cabin door. Clara, who was kneading bread with Sarah's help while the men worked outside, felt her stomach clench with sudden apprehension. Visitors were rare in winter, and unexpected ones almost never brought good news. Jed appeared at the door before the second knock, rifle held casually but ready, his expression alert. Behind him stood Ray Miller, equally wary. In the months they'd been living together, both men had developed protective instincts toward their small community that bordered on the fierce. "Sheriff Hawkins," Jed said as he opened the door, his tone carefully neutral. "What brings you out in this weather?" Sheriff Martin Hawkins was a man Clara remembered from her visits to town with Thomas, tall, silver-haired, with the kind of rigid, moral certainty that made him effective at keeping order but sometimes blind to the complexities of human need. He stepped into the cabin without invitation, his pale eyes taking in the domestic scene with obvious disapproval. "Mrs. Larkins," he said, touching his hat brim in perfunctory greeting. "I've come on official business." Clara wiped flour from her hands, fighting to keep her expression calm despite the dread pooling in her stomach. "What kind of official business, Sheriff?" "The kind that concerns the moral welfare of the community," Hawkins replied, his gaze moving deliberately between Clara and Jed. "I've received complaints about the arrangements at this homestead." "What kind of complaints?" Sarah Miller asked, stepping protectively closer to Clara. "And from whom?" "The nature of the complaints should be obvious," Hawkins said stiffly. "A widowed woman in a delicate condition, living in unmarried cohabitation with a drifter of questionable character. It's a scandal that reflects poorly on the entire territory." Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, part anger, part humiliation at having her private life discussed as community property. "Sheriff, Mr. Boone and I are engaged to be married. He's been helping me manage the homestead through the winter. Nothing more." "Engaged, you say?" Hawkins's tone suggested he found the claim dubious. "And when exactly did this engagement take place? Before or after you began living together?" "That's none of your damned business," Jed said quietly. But there was steel beneath his words. "I'm afraid it is my business, Mr. Boone," Hawkins replied. "When citizens express concern about moral impropriety, especially involving a woman in Mrs. Larkins's condition, the law requires me to investigate." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Clara asked, though she suspected she already knew. "I'm suggesting that appearances matter, Mrs. Larkins, and the appearance of your situation is that you're living in sin with a man who has no legal or moral claim to be here. That's not the kind of example we want set in a territory trying to attract respectable families." Ray Miller stepped forward, his work-hardened hands clenched into fists. "Sheriff, with all due respect, you don't know what you're talking about. These are decent people who've opened their home to my family when we had nowhere else to turn. Whatever gossip you've been hearing, it's not based on truth. Is that so? Hawkins turned his attention to Ray with interest. And you'd be willing to testify to that in court, would you? Testify that nothing improper has occurred under this roof. The threat was clear, and Clara felt the walls of her carefully constructed new life beginning to crumble. A court case would destroy her reputation regardless of the outcome, make it impossible for her to remain in the territory, leave her child marked by scandal from birth. "Sheriff," she said, fighting to keep her voice steady, "what would it take to resolve this matter quietly? What do you need to satisfy these concerned citizens?" Hawkins smiled, and it wasn't a pleasant expression. "Mrs. Larkins, the solution is obvious. Either you marry Mr. Boone immediately, with proper ceremony and witnesses, or he removes himself from your property until such time as a legitimate marriage can be arranged. The current situation cannot continue." "We've been planning to marry," Clara said. "The weather has made travel to town impossible, but I'm authorized to perform marriages," Hawkins interrupted. "I could conduct the ceremony today if you're genuinely committed to legitimizing this relationship." Clara looked at Jed, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his expression. They'd wanted to marry, had been planning it for weeks, but not like this. Not under threat, not with a gun to their heads, not because some busybody neighbor had decided to sit in judgment on their choices. "And if we refuse?" Jed asked quietly. "Then I'm afraid I'll have to insist that you leave the property immediately," Hawkins said. "And given the questions that have been raised about Mrs. Larkins' moral fitness, the territorial authorities may need to intervene to ensure the welfare of her unborn child." The threat hit Clara like a physical blow. They could take her baby away, place it with a suitable family, leave her with nothing because she dared to accept help when she needed it most. The injustice of it, the way her survival was being twisted into evidence of moral failing, made her want to scream. But screaming wouldn't help. Nothing would help except playing by rules that had been designed to punish women for the crime of existing without male protection. "We'll marry today," Clara said, her voice hollow with defeat, "if that's what it takes to satisfy your concerned citizens." "Clara," Jed said softly, moving to her side, "you don't have to do this. Not like this. I can leave, find somewhere else to winter, come back in spring when the gossip dies down." "No," Clara said firmly, though her heart was breaking. "No, Jed. If you leave now, they'll never let you come back. They'll make sure of that. And I won't lose you because some small-minded people can't stand to see others helping each other." Sheriff Hawkins looked satisfied with the capitulation, already reaching into his coat for what Clara assumed was a prayer book or marriage certificate. But Sarah Miller wasn't finished fighting. "Sheriff," she said, her voice deceptively mild, "I'm curious about these complaints you mentioned. Exactly who filed them and when?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss because it seems mighty convenient that these moral concerns should surface just now, when the worst of winter is behind us and travel is becoming possible again. Almost as if someone waited until they were sure their complaint would be acted on quickly." Hawkins's jaw tightened. "Mrs. Miller, I don't appreciate your implication." "I'm not implying anything," Sarah replied sweetly. "I'm stating facts. Mrs. Larkins has been living quietly on her own property, bothering no one, helping neighbors in need. The only people who would know enough about her private arrangements to file complaints would be those who've been watching her very closely indeed." "Which makes a person wonder," Ray added, catching his wife's direction. "What kind of man spends his time spying on a pregnant widow instead of tending to his own affairs?" Clara saw understanding dawn in Jed's eyes, and her own suspicions crystallized into certainty. There was only one person who would have both the knowledge and the motivation to cause this trouble. Henrik Paulson, the Norwegian bachelor who trapped beaver in the creek bottoms and had been making increasingly unwelcome overtures since Thomas's death. "Henrik," she said quietly. "Henrik Paulson filed the complaint, didn't he? Hawkins' expression confirmed her guess, even as he tried to maintain his official demeanor. The identity of the complainant is not relevant to— "It's very relevant," Clara interrupted, anger finally overriding her fear. "Because Henrik Paulson has been pressuring me to marry him since my husband died. He's made it clear that he considers this homestead a prize worth winning, and me a helpless woman in need of his protection. When I made it clear I wasn't interested, he threatened to make trouble for me. I suppose this is his way of following through. Mrs. Larkins, regardless of anyone's personal motivations—" "No," Clara said, her voice rising. "Don't you dare stand there and pretend this is about community morality when it's really about one man's wounded pride. Henrik couldn't force me to marry him, so he's using you to force me into a situation where I have no choices left." The cabin had gone very quiet, everyone understanding that they'd reached a moment of truth. Hawkins could back down, admit that he'd been manipulated into serving one man's selfish interests, or he could double down on his authority, force the marriage, and become complicit in what amounted to legal coercion. "The law is the law," Hawkins said finally. "Whatever personal motivations may exist, the fact remains that your current living arrangements are inappropriate and must be resolved." "Then let's resolve them," Jed said, his voice carrying a new note of determination. "Clara, will you marry me? Not because some sheriff says you have to, not because Henrik Paulson is trying to force your hand, but because we love each other and want to build a life together." Clara looked at him, really looked, seeing past the circumstances that had brought them to this moment. Yes, they were being coerced. Yes, their private joy was being twisted into a public spectacle. But underneath all that remained the simple truth. She loved this man, wanted to spend her life with him, wanted their child to grow up knowing Jed as a father. "Yes," she said clearly. "Yes, Jedediah Boone, I'll marry you. Today, tomorrow, or any day you'll have me." "Then let's do this properly," Jed said, taking her hands in his. "Sheriff, we appreciate your offer to perform the ceremony, but we'd prefer to wait for proper arrangements. A real wedding, with time to prepare, with our friends present as witnesses we've chosen, rather than authorities we've been forced to accept." Hawkins's face darkened. "Mr. Boone, I don't think you understand the seriousness of this situation." "I understand perfectly," Jed replied. "You've got a man with hurt feelings trying to use the law to punish a woman who wouldn't submit to his advances. You've got gossips who think they have the right to police other people's private lives. And you've got a sheriff who's forgotten that his job is to protect citizens, not harass them. How dare you? How dare I speak the truth?" Jed stepped closer to Hawkins, and Clara could see the carefully controlled anger in his stance. "Sheriff, Clara and I will marry when we choose to marry, in the manner we choose. If that's not fast enough for Henrik Paulson or anyone else, they're welcome to mind their own business. And if I insist on immediate compliance, then you'll have to arrest me," Jed said simply, "because I'm not leaving this woman to face winter alone. And I'm not letting you force her into a marriage ceremony that makes a mockery of something sacred." The standoff stretched between them, thick with tension and unspoken threats. Clara could see Hawkins calculating. How much trouble would it be to actually arrest Jed? How much paperwork would that generate? How much scrutiny would it bring to his handling of the situation? Finally, the sheriff seemed to reach a decision. "You have 1 week," he said curtly. 1 week to arrange a proper ceremony, with proper witnesses, properly recorded in the territorial records. If this situation isn't resolved by then, I'll be back with a warrant." "That's acceptable," Clara said before Jed could escalate further. 1 week will be sufficient." Hawkins nodded stiffly, clearly unhappy with the compromise, but unwilling to push further. "I'll hold you to that, Mrs. Larkins, and I'll be checking personally to ensure compliance." After he left, the cabin erupted in angry conversation. Sarah and Ray expressing outrage at the sheriff's high-handed behavior, Jed pacing like a caged wolf, the children asking confused questions about why the man had been so angry. But Clara, found herself oddly calm, centered in a way she hadn't felt since this whole crisis began. They had 1 week to marry on their own terms, to reclaim control over their own lives. 1 week to prove that love could triumph over spite, that people committed to each other couldn't be broken by the small-minded cruelty of those who would use the law as a weapon. "Well," she said finally, her voice cutting through the chaos, "I suppose we'd better start planning a wedding." And for the first time since Sheriff Hawkins had knocked on their door, Clara smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes and spoke of defiance, determination, and the unshakable belief that some things were worth fighting for. The week that followed Sheriff Hawkins's ultimatum transformed the cabin into a whirlwind of preparation unlike anything Clara had ever experienced. What should have been a joyous time of wedding planning became an urgent race against time, complicated by the harsh realities of frontier life and the growing demands of Clara's advancing pregnancy. Sarah Miller took charge of the practical arrangements, with the efficiency of a general marshalling troops. "First things first," she declared the morning after the sheriff's visit. "We need witnesses, real witnesses, people whose word carries weight in this territory." "The Andersons might come," Clara suggested tentatively. "They live about 12 miles south, and Mrs. Anderson helped me when Thomas first took sick." "Good. They're established, respectable. Anyone else?" "There's the Reverend Matthews in town, but I don't know if he'd travel this far in winter weather." "Leave." "That to me," Ray said, looking up from the harness he was mending. "I'll ride to town today, explain the situation to the Reverend. If he won't come, maybe he knows someone who will." What Ray didn't say, but everyone understood, was that they needed an officiant who couldn't be influenced by Henrik Paulson or intimidated by Sheriff Hawkins. Someone whose authority was unquestionable and whose integrity was beyond reproach. While Ray prepared for his journey to town, Sarah and Clara threw themselves into the domestic preparations. There would need to be food for the wedding guests, proper clothes for the ceremony, some attempt at making the cabin festive despite the cramped quarters and winter's lingering grip. "I have my mother's wedding dress," Clara said, then paused as the reality hit her, "though I'm not sure it will fit anymore." Sarah studied Clara's growing figure with a practical eye. "We can let it out, add panels if necessary. The important thing is that you feel beautiful on your wedding day." The dress, when they retrieved it from the cedar chest, was a simple affair of cream-colored wool with pearl buttons and delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. Clara's mother had worn it in 1858, and Clara had worn it to marry Thomas in 1880. Now, in 1882, it would serve for her second wedding, if they could make it fit. As Sarah worked her needle magic, letting out seams and adding fabric from an old petticoat, Clara found herself thinking about the strange, circular nature of life. This dress had witnessed 3 decades of love, loss, and new beginnings. It had seen her mother's hopes fulfilled and dashed, had celebrated Clara's first marriage, and mourned her first widowhood. Now it would bless her second chance at happiness, if circumstances allowed. "There," Sarah said finally, holding up the altered dress. "It won't win any fashion prizes, but it's respectable and it fits. More importantly, it carries your family's blessing." Jed, meanwhile, was wrestling with preparations of his own. His only good clothes were the ones he'd been wearing when he arrived, patched but clean, serviceable, but hardly wedding-worthy. Ray offered to lend him a jacket, but the 2 men were built differently, and the fit was awkward at best. "It doesn't matter," Clara assured him when she saw his frustration. "I'm not marrying your clothes, Jed. I'm marrying you." "I know that," he replied, running his hands through his hair. "But I want to do this right, Clara. I want to stand up in front of witnesses and promise to love you for the rest of my life. And I want to look like a man worthy of that privilege." His words touched something deep in Clara's heart. This man who owned nothing but his integrity, who'd been forced into circumstances not of his choosing, still wanted to honor her with the best he could offer. It was a reminder of why she'd fallen in love with him, not for what he possessed, but for who he was. "Jed," she said softly, moving to where he stood by the window. "Do you remember what you told me about choosing love every day? Yes, that's what I want from our wedding. Not perfect clothes or elaborate ceremonies, but a moment when we choose each other in front of people who matter to us. The rest is just decoration." Ray returned from town the next evening with encouraging news. Reverend Matthews couldn't make the journey himself. His wife was ill, and he couldn't leave her. But he'd given Ray a letter of introduction to Father O'Sullivan, the Catholic priest who served the scattered Irish families in the territory. Father O'Sullivan had agreed to perform the ceremony despite the fact that neither Clara nor Jed was Catholic. He said love was love, Ray reported, and any couple willing to commit their lives to each other in the sight of God deserved the Church's blessing, regardless of denomination. "What about witnesses?" Clara asked. "The Andersons will come, and so will the Mackenzies. You remember them, the Scotts family who settled near Widow's Creek. Father O'Sullivan is bringing along Mrs. Flanagan from town to serve as an additional witness. She's been looking after his housekeeping since his last housekeeper married and moved away. It wasn't a large gathering, but it would be sufficient. More importantly, these were people whose word carried weight in the community, whose presence at the ceremony would legitimize the marriage in ways that went beyond legal requirements." As the week progressed, Clara found herself dealing with more than wedding preparations. The baby, as if sensing the stress and excitement, had become increasingly active. What had been gentle movements just weeks before were now vigorous kicks and rolls that sometimes took her breath away. Sarah, with her experience, assured her this was normal for a pregnancy nearing its end. "First babies can come any time after 8 months, she explained, as they worked together on wedding preparations. And all this excitement might encourage the little one to make an early appearance. "During the wedding?" Clara asked, alarmed. "Probably not, but soon after, possibly. We should make sure we're prepared for that possibility." So alongside the wedding preparations, they assembled supplies for the birth: clean linens, sharp knives, strong thread, herbs that Sarah swore by for easing labor pains. It was sobering to realize that Clara might go from bride to mother within days of each other, but it was also strangely fitting. This marriage wasn't just about love between two people. It was about creating a family, building a future, establishing something permanent in a world that seemed determined to remain uncertain. The weather, which had been cooperating with their plans, took a turn for the worse 3 days before the scheduled ceremony. Snow began falling again, not the violent blizzard they'd weathered earlier in the winter, but a steady, persistent storm that promised to make travel difficult if not impossible. "What if they can't get through?" Clara asked, watching the snow. "Accumulate outside the cabin windows. They'll get through," Jed said with more confidence than he probably felt. "Father O'Sullivan strikes me as a man who keeps his word, and the others know how important this is. But what if Sheriff Hawkins decides the storm gives him an excuse to—" "Clara." Jed took her hands, stilling their nervous movement. "Stop borrowing trouble. We've done everything we can to prepare. The people who matter know what's at stake. If the storm delays things by a day or two, that's not the end of the world. But the deadline is arbitrary and punitive," Jed finished firmly. "Hawkins set it to pressure us, not because there's any real legal requirement. If we have to marry a day late because of weather, no reasonable person would fault us for that." Clara wanted to believe him, but she'd seen enough of frontier justice to know that reason didn't always prevail. Men like Hawkins and Paulson operated according to their own logic, and they weren't above using technicalities to achieve their goals. As if summoned by her fears, another visitor appeared at their door on the evening before the wedding. But this time it wasn't an official with a badge. It was Henrik Paulson himself, drunk and belligerent, come to make one last attempt at claiming what he believed was rightfully his. "Clara!" he shouted from outside the cabin, his voice slurred but audible even through the storm. "Clara Larkins, you come out here and talk to me." Jed was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, but Clara stopped him with a gesture. This was her. Fight, her problem to resolve. She'd been avoiding this confrontation for months, but now it could be delayed no longer. "Stay inside," she told the others, then opened the door and stepped onto the small porch, pulling a shawl around her shoulders. Against the cold, Henrik stood in the falling snow like a figure from a bad dream. Tall, gaunt, swaying slightly from drink, but still radiating the kind of focused intensity that made him dangerous. His pale eyes fixed on Clara with an expression that mixed desire and fury in equal measure. "So it's true," he said, his Norwegian accent thickened by alcohol. "You're really going to marry that drifter tomorrow?" "Yes, Henrik, I am, and you need to leave, now." "Leave?" Henrik laughed bitterly. "Leave the woman I've been courting since her husband died? Leave the land that should have been mine by rights? You never courted me," Clara said firmly. "You pestered me. You made unwelcome advances and refused to accept my refusal. That's not courting, that's harassment." "I offered you security," Henrik shouted, stepping closer to the porch. "I offered you a proper home, a respectable name, a future for your bastard child." The insult to her unborn baby snapped something inside Clara. All the fear, all the stress of the past week, all the accumulated fury at being treated like property, to be claimed rather than a person with rights of her own. It all boiled over in a moment of crystalline rage. "Get off my land," she said, her voice deadly quiet. "Get off my land right now, or I'll put a bullet in you myself. You don't have the courage. Try me." The standoff might have escalated further, but Jed's voice cut through the tension from inside the cabin. "Clara, step back inside, now." She obeyed, backing through the doorway while keeping her eyes on Henrik. Jed appeared beside her, rifle raised and ready, his expression promising violence if Henrik took one more step toward the cabin. "Paulson," he said conversationally, "you're drunk, you're trespassing, and you're threatening a pregnant woman. Any one of those things would justify me shooting you. All three together make it practically a public service." Henrik's hand moved toward the gun at his hip, but the motion was clumsy, telegraphed. Ray Miller materialized from the shadows beside. "The cabin! His own weapon trained on the intruder." "I wouldn't," Ray advised mildly. "I may not be the fastest draw in the territory, but at this range, speed doesn't matter much." For a moment, the tableau held. 3 armed men and a pregnant woman, all balanced on the knife's edge of violence. Then Henrik seemed to deflate, the fight going out of him as sobriety began to reassert itself. "This isn't over," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Clara replied. "After tomorrow, I'll be a married woman with a husband who knows how to defend what's his. If you're smart, Henrik, you'll accept that and move on." Henrik stared at her for a long moment, then spat in the snow and stumbled away into the storm. They watched until he disappeared into the swirling white, then Jed carefully closed and barred the door. "Well," Sarah said into the silence that followed, "I suppose that settles any question about whether we're doing the right thing." Clara sank into her chair, adrenaline leaving her shaky and exhausted. Tomorrow she would marry the man she loved, surrounded by friends who supported her choice. Tonight, she just had to get through the long hours until dawn, praying that Henrik's drunken threats were empty bluster and that the storm wouldn't prevent their witnesses from arriving. "Clara," Jed said softly, kneeling beside her chair, "are you all right?" "I'm fine," she replied, though her voice trembled slightly. "Just tired of being afraid, tired of letting other people's opinions dictate my choices. After tomorrow, you won't have to," he promised. "After tomorrow, we'll face whatever comes together." Clara leaned into his warmth, drawing strength from his steady presence. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small cabin, love was preparing to triumph over fear, hope over despair, and commitment over the kind of selfish possessiveness that had driven Henrik to such desperate measures. Tomorrow couldn't. It'd come soon enough. Dawn broke clear and bitter cold on Clara's wedding day, the storm having blown itself out sometime before sunrise. The world outside sparkled under a fresh coating of snow, pristine and beautiful, as if nature itself had dressed up for the occasion. Clara woke with a mixture of excitement and trepidation that had nothing to do with pre-wedding nerves and everything to do with the peculiar sensations she'd been experiencing since the middle of the night. The baby had been restless for hours, shifting and pressing against her ribs with an urgency that felt different from its usual movements. More concerning were the cramping pains that had begun around midnight. Not severe, but regular enough to make her wonder if Sarah's prediction about early labor might be coming true. "Sarah," she whispered, not wanting to wake the others if her concerns proved unfounded. Sarah Miller was instantly alert, a skill learned from years of motherhood. She moved quietly to Clara's bedside, her experienced hands assessing the situation. With gentle efficiency. "How long?" she asked softly. "Since midnight, maybe earlier. The pains aren't bad, but they're coming regularly. And the baby feels different, lower, somehow." Sarah nodded thoughtfully. "Could be false labor. First pregnancies sometimes do that. Or it could be the real thing starting slow. Either way, we should take precautions." They moved carefully around the cabin, Sarah checking Clara's pulse and color, while Clara tried to gauge whether the sensations were strengthening or fading. Outside, she could hear Jed and Ray beginning their morning chores, their voices carrying the particular energy of men preparing for an important day. "Should we tell them?" Clara asked. "Not yet," Sarah decided. "If it's false labor, we don't want to panic everyone unnecessarily. If it's real labor, we'll have plenty of time. First babies usually take their time arriving." The morning progressed with careful normalcy. Everyone focused on final preparations for the ceremony. Father O'Sullivan was expected by noon, along with the witnesses who'd promised to attend. The cabin had been cleaned and rearranged to accommodate the gathering, with Clara's mother's quilt spread over the rough table to serve as an altar cloth. But as the hours passed, Clara found it increasingly difficult to hide her discomfort. The cramping pains were definitely stronger now, and she'd begun to notice a pattern. They came in waves, building to a peak before subsiding, then returning with clockwork regularity every few minutes. "Clara," Jed said during their mid-morning, "Meal, you look pale. Are you feeling all right?" She started to give the automatic reassurance, then stopped herself. This man was about to become her husband, the father of her child, in every way that mattered. He deserved honesty, even if the truth complicated their carefully laid plans. "I think the baby might be coming," she said quietly. The words hit the cabin like a thunderclap. Jed went rigid, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Ray Miller looked up from the harness he was working on, his eyes wide with concern. Even the children, Jimmy and young Thomas, seemed to sense that something momentous was happening. "Now?" Jed asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Soon, maybe," Clara replied. "Sarah thinks it could still be false labor, but the pains are getting stronger." "How much stronger?" The question came from Sarah, who was already moving toward the supplies they'd prepared for this possibility. "Strong enough that I can't ignore them anymore," Clara admitted, "and they're coming about every 5 minutes now." Sarah's expression shifted from cautious optimism to focused preparation. "That's real labor," she said decisively. "Early, but not dangerously so. First babies born at 8 months usually do fine, especially if the mother's been healthy throughout the pregnancy." "What does this mean for the wedding?" Ray asked, voicing the question everyone was thinking. Clara felt tears prick her eyes as the implications sank in. They'd fought so hard to arrange this ceremony, had overcome so many obstacles to claim their right to marry on their own terms. Now, when everything was finally in place, her own body was threatening to derail their plans. "Maybe we can delay it," she said desperately. "If I can just hold off for a few hours." "Clara," Sarah interrupted gently, "that's not how babies work. They come when they're ready, not when it's convenient for us. And trying to delay labor can be dangerous for both you and the child." "But the deadline," Clara protested. "Sheriff Hawkins said." "Sheriff Hawkins can go to hell," Jed said with quiet fury. "Clara, I'm not going to let you risk your life and our baby's health because some petty tyrant wants to flex his authority. But if we don't marry today, he'll force you to leave. And Henrik will find some way to—" Another contraction hit her, mid-sentence, stronger than the others, stealing her breath and forcing her to grip the edge of the table for support. When it passed, she found Jed kneeling beside her chair, his hands covering hers, his eyes dark with concern and determination. "Listen to me," he said urgently. "I don't care about Sheriff Hawkins or Henrik Paulson or anyone else who wants to interfere with our lives. What matters right now is you and this baby. Everything else can wait." "But no buts," Jed said firmly. "Clara, I love you. I want to marry you more than anything in the world, but I want you alive and healthy more. Then I want a wedding ceremony. If the baby's coming today, then we'll welcome that baby today and worry about the rest later." Sarah was bustling around the cabin now, gathering supplies and issuing quiet instructions to Ray about boiling water and preparing clean linens. The domestic crisis was taking precedence over social complications, and Clara found herself oddly comforted by the shift in priorities. "What if?" Ray said suddenly. "What if we do both?" Everyone turned to look at him. "Both what?" Clara asked. "The wedding and the birth. Father O'Sullivan is supposed to arrive at noon, right? That's still 2 hours away. If your labor is progressing slowly, like Sarah says first labors usually do, maybe we could have a quick ceremony before things get too intense." Clara stared at him, hope and disbelief warring in her chest. "You mean get married while I'm in labor?" "Why not?" Ray asked, warming to his idea. "It's not exactly traditional, but then nothing about your courtship has been traditional. And think about it. What better way to start a marriage than by bringing new life into the world together?" "It would certainly be memorable," Sarah said with a wry smile. "And practical, too. If the ceremony happens before the baby arrives, Sheriff Hawkins can't claim you weren't properly married when the child was born." Jed looked at Clara, his expression uncertain. "What do you think? Are you up for it?" Clara considered the proposal, weighing the risks against the benefits. Yes, it was unconventional to the point of scandal. Yes, it would be uncomfortable and possibly embarrassing. But it would also be deeply meaningful. Two people committing to each other at the exact moment. They were about to become a family. "Yes," she said finally. "Yes, let's do it. Let's get married and have a baby on the same day." The next 2 hours passed in a blur of preparation that defied easy description. While Sarah helped Clara into her wedding dress, carefully altered to accommodate her condition, Jed and Ray rearranged the cabin to serve as both chapel and birthing room. The children were given special responsibilities that made them feel important while keeping them out of the way. Father O'Sullivan arrived precisely at noon, a small, weathered Irishman with kind eyes and hands that spoke of decades spent in physical labor. He took in the situation with remarkable equanimity, listening to their explanation without judgment or surprise. "Well now," he said in a musical brogue, "I've married couples in all sorts of circumstances, during floods, after fires, once even during a tornado. But I believe this would be my first wedding and birth combination. Are you willing to do it?" Clara asked, gripping Jed's hand as another contraction built and peaked. "Lass, I've never seen two people more clearly meant for each other," Father O'Sullivan replied. "If the good Lord is sending you a baby on your wedding day, who am I to argue with his timing?" The Anderson and Mackenzie families arrived shortly after, along with Mrs. Flanagan from town, their faces showing amazement at the circumstances they'd walked into. But frontier people were adaptable by necessity, and within minutes they'd integrated themselves into the organized chaos of simultaneous wedding and birth preparations. "How are the pains?" Sarah asked, as Clara tried to find a comfortable position for the ceremony. "Stronger," Clara admitted, "and closer together, maybe every 3 minutes now." "That's still plenty of time," Sarah assured her. "First babies usually take hours from this point. We can easily get you married before things get serious." The ceremony itself was unlike any wedding Clara had ever imagined. She stood beside Jed in her altered wedding dress, one hand in his and the other resting on her contracting belly, surrounded by friends who'd risked winter travel to witness their union. Father O'Sullivan's words were simple and heartfelt, focusing on love, commitment, and the sacred nature of the family they were creating. "Do you, Jedediah Boone, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Jed said, his voice steady despite the extraordinary circumstances. "And do you, Clara Mae Larkins, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, for better or worse, as long as you both shall live?" Clara opened her mouth to respond, just as another contraction hit, this one strong enough to make her gasp and lean heavily on Jed's arm. When it passed, she looked up at him with tears in her eyes and a smile that lit up her entire face. "I do," she said clearly. "Oh, Jed, I absolutely do." "Then by the power vested in me by God Almighty and the territory of Montana," Father O'Sullivan proclaimed, "I pronounce you husband and wife. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." The kiss that sealed their marriage was gentle and reverent, full of promise and hope, but it was interrupted by Clara's sharp intake of breath as the strongest contraction yet gripped her body, signaling that their baby was no longer content to wait for convenient timing. "Well, Mrs. Boone," Jed whispered against her ear, using her new name for the first time, "it looks like we're about to become parents." "Together," Clara whispered back, her voice fierce with love and determination. "We're going to do this together." And as their wedding guests transformed into a birthing support team, as the cabin filled with the ancient rhythms of new life demanding to be born, Clara realized that this strange, chaotic, wonderful day was exactly what their love deserved. Not a conventional ceremony that satisfied other people's expectations, but a celebration of commitment that honored the unique circumstances that had brought them together. The transformation of their wedding celebration into a birthing chamber happened with the kind of fluid efficiency that spoke to the practical nature of frontier life. Mrs. Flanagan, who'd delivered more babies than she could count during her years as a midwife in Ireland, took charge alongside Sarah Miller. The men were relegated to boiling water, tending the fire, and keeping the children occupied in the far corner of the cabin. Clara's labor progressed with startling speed once the ceremony concluded, as if the baby had been waiting politely for its parents to make their commitment official before demanding full attention. The contractions that had been manageable during the wedding were now coming every 2 minutes, each one stronger than the last, building toward the moment when their child would finally make its entrance into the world. "This is happening fast for a first baby," Mrs. Flanagan observed, her weathered hands gentle as she helped Clara find a more comfortable position. "But everything looks normal, love. Your little one is just eager to meet its parents." Jed hovered nearby, his face pale but determined, clearly struggling with the helplessness that most men felt during childbirth. Clara reached for his hand during a brief respite between contractions, drawing strength from his solid presence. "Are you all right?" she asked, which struck everyone in the cabin as wonderfully characteristic. A woman in the throes of labor, worrying about her husband's comfort. "I should be asking you that," Jed replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Clara, you're the strongest person I've ever known." "Not strong," Clara gasped as another contraction began building. "Just stubborn." "There's a difference. Sometimes they're the same thing," Sarah said with a smile, efficiently arranging clean linens and checking the supplies they'd assembled. "And stubbornness is exactly what you need right now." The afternoon wore on with the timeless rhythm of birth, periods of intense activity punctuated by moments of relative calm, the steady progression toward a goal that couldn't be rushed or controlled. Clara found herself entering a strange state where time seemed both endless and compressed, where the world narrowed to the immediate sensations of her body and the faces of the people surrounding her with love and support. Father O'Sullivan, after ensuring that the marriage certificate was properly signed and witnessed, had quietly removed himself to the far end of the cabin, where he sat with Ray Miller and the children, telling stories in his musical Irish accent to keep the young. Once calm and distracted, it was a kindness that Clara noticed even through her increasing focus on the work of bringing her child into the world. "The baby's crowning," Mrs. Flanagan announced suddenly, her voice carrying the excitement that marked this most crucial phase of labor. "Clara, love, with the next contraction I need you to push with everything you have." Clara nodded, gathering her remaining strength for the final effort. Jed moved to support her shoulders, his face a mixture of awe and terror as he prepared to witness the birth of their child. Sarah positioned herself to assist Mrs. Flanagan, while the others in the cabin fell silent, understanding that they were about to witness something sacred. The contraction built slowly, then hit with overwhelming intensity. Clara bore down with every ounce of strength she possessed, feeling as though her body was being turned inside out by forces beyond her control. Then, suddenly, there was a sensation of release, of completion, followed by the most beautiful sound she'd ever heard, the thin, outraged wail of a newborn taking its first breath. "It's a girl," Mrs. Flanagan announced, her voice thick with emotion as she lifted the tiny, squirming infant. A perfect, beautiful girl. Clara collapsed back against Jed's supporting arms, exhausted but triumphant, tears streaming down her face as she looked at the small miracle that had just emerged from her body. The baby was red and wrinkled and covered in birth fluids, but she was also unmistakably alive, healthy, and absolutely perfect. "Is she?" Clara began, then stopped, overwhelmed by emotion. "She's beautiful," Jed whispered, his own voice breaking with wonder. "Clara, she's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Mrs. Flanagan worked with practiced efficiency, clearing the baby's airways and ensuring she was breathing properly before wrapping her in one of the soft blankets they'd prepared. The tiny girl continued to cry lustily, her small fists waving in indignation at being thrust from her warm, dark sanctuary into the bright, cold world. "Here you go, Mama," Mrs. Flanagan said, placing the baby in Clara's arms. "Meet your daughter." The moment the baby settled against Clara's chest, her crying subsided to small, questioning sounds, as if she recognized the heartbeat she'd been listening to for months. Clara looked down at the tiny face, so small, so delicate, but already showing hints of personality in the way her dark eyes seemed to focus on her mother's face. "Hello, little one," Clara whispered. "I'm your mama, and this is your papa. We've been waiting so long to meet you." Jed reached out with one finger to touch the baby's tiny hand, his expression one of absolute wonder. When the infant's fingers reflexively closed around his, he made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "She's holding on to me," he said in amazement. "She knows her papa," Sarah said softly. "Babies are smarter than people give them credit for." The practical work of birth wasn't quite finished. There was still the placenta to deliver, Clara to clean up and make comfortable, the baby to properly examine and care for. But the dangerous part was over. The moment of greatest risk had passed, and their daughter had arrived safely into a world where she was already deeply loved. As Mrs. Flanagan and Sarah attended to the medical necessities, the other members of their makeshift community began to stir from the hushed reverence that had marked the birth itself. The Anderson and Mackenzie families offered congratulations and blessings, their faces showing the particular joy that came from witnessing new life in harsh country where survival was never guaranteed. "What will you name her?" Mrs. Anderson asked, when Clara was finally settled comfortably with her daughter nursing at her breast. Clara looked at Jed, realizing they'd been so focused on preparing for the birth itself that they'd barely discussed names. "We never really decided," she admitted. "What about Hope?" Jed suggested quietly. It seems fitting, considering how she came into the world. Clara considered the name, testing how it felt. Hope Boone. Yes, it was perfect. A name that honored not just the circumstances of the baby's birth, but the journey that had brought all three of them to this moment. Hope, she repeated. Hope Elizabeth Boone. The middle name was for Clara's mother, a woman who'd never lived to see her granddaughter, but whose love lived on in the quilt that had blessed their wedding and would now warm their baby. Welcome to the world, Hope Elizabeth, Jed said formally, leaning down to kiss both. His wife and daughter, you picked quite a day to make your entrance. As if she understood the humor in the situation, baby Hope chose that moment to open her eyes and look directly at her father. Her expression so serious and alert that everyone in the cabin burst into laughter. She's already got opinions, Ray Miller observed. That's going to be an interesting child to raise. She comes by it honestly, Clara said, thinking of her own stubborn nature and Jed's quiet determination. I have a feeling she's going to keep us on our toes. The celebration continued as evening approached, with Father O'Sullivan offering a blessing over the new family, and Mrs. Flanagan sharing wisdom about caring for newborns. The Anderson and Mackenzie families, despite the late hour and difficult travel conditions, seemed reluctant to leave this magical tableau of new beginnings. But eventually practical concerns reasserted themselves. The guests had to make their way home before full darkness fell, and Clara needed rest after the exertions of the day. One by one, their friends offered final congratulations and blessings. Before venturing out into the crisp winter evening, Father O'Sullivan was the last to leave, pausing at the door to look back at the scene inside the cabin. Clara propped up in bed with Hope sleeping peacefully in her arms, Jed sitting beside them with an expression of absolute contentment, the Miller family quietly cleaning up from the day's festivities. In all my years of ministry, the priest said quietly, I've never seen anything quite like this. A wedding and a birth on the same day, love triumphing over adversity, a family born from the ashes of loss. It's been a privilege to witness it. Thank you, Father, Clara said, for everything. For coming so far in difficult weather, for understanding why this had to happen the way it did. Ah, lass, Father O'Sullivan replied with a gentle smile. I think the good Lord had his hand in today's events. Sometimes the most beautiful things happen in ways we never could have planned. After he left, the cabin settled into a different kind of quiet, not the tense silence of waiting, but the peaceful hush of completion. Sarah helped Clara get comfortable for the night, ensuring that both mother and baby were clean, warm, and properly positioned for nursing. The men banked the fire and checked that all was secure for the night. As Clara lay in the bed that was now officially hers and Jed's, holding their daughter close to her heart, she reflected on the extraordinary day that had just passed. She'd awakened as Clara Larkins, a pregnant widow facing an uncertain future. She was ending it as Clara Boone, a married woman with a husband who adored her and a daughter who represented all their hopes for the future. No regrets? Jed asked softly, settling beside her with careful attention to her comfort. None, Clara replied without hesitation. Well, maybe one small regret. What's that? I'm sorry Hope will never know her other father, Clara said quietly. Thomas would have loved her so much. He would have been such a good papa to her. Jed was quiet for a moment, understanding the complexity of emotions that came with loving again after loss. She'll know about him, he said finally. We'll make sure of that. She'll know that she had two fathers who loved her, one who helped create her, and one who chose to claim her as his own. Clara felt tears prick her eyes again, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. This man beside her understood that love didn't diminish when it was shared, that honoring the past didn't threaten the future. I love you, Jedediah Boone, she whispered. And I love you, Clara Boone, he replied. Both of you, more than I ever thought possible. Outside, the Montana wind was picking up again, promising another cold night. But inside their small cabin, 3 hearts beat in the steady rhythm of family, surrounded by the warmth of love that had been tested by adversity and emerged stronger than ever. Spring came to the Montana Territory with the gentle persistence of hope fulfilled, melting the last of winter's grip and revealing a world transformed by more than just the changing seasons. Clara stood at the window of their cabin, now properly expanded with the additional room Jed and Ray had built during the long winter months, watching her husband work in the garden plot where he was preparing soil for their first planting as a married couple. 3 months had passed since Hope's dramatic entrance into the world, and the baby had grown from a tiny, wrinkled newborn into a plump, alert infant who seemed to absorb everything around her with serious dark eyes that reminded Clara of both Thomas's thoughtfulness and Jed's quiet intensity. She was sleeping peacefully in the handcrafted cradle that had become Jed's winter project, a masterpiece of carved wood that spoke of love made manifest in practical beauty. "She's getting so big," Sarah Miller observed, joining Clara at the window. The Miller family had stayed through the winter, their arrangement proving beneficial to everyone involved. With spring's arrival, they were preparing to return to their own homestead, but the bonds forged during those close quarters had created friendships that would last a lifetime. "Too big," Clara replied with a smile. "I swear she grows every time. I turn around, pretty soon she'll be walking and talking and getting into everything." "That's what babies do," Sarah said with the wisdom of experience. "They grow up whether we're ready or not. The trick is enjoying each stage while it lasts." Through the window, they could see Ray and Jed discussing plans for the expanded garden, their gestures animated as they laid out schemes for crops that would feed both families through the coming year. The sight filled Clara with deep contentment. 2 good men working together, building something lasting in this harsh but beautiful country. "I'm going to miss this," Sarah continued, her voice carrying a note of wistfulness. "Living so close, sharing the daily work, feeling like we're all part of one big family." "We'll always be family," Clara assured her. "Distance doesn't change that. And you're only 15 miles away, close enough for regular visits, especially once the trails dry out completely." The knock at the door interrupted their conversation, and Clara felt a familiar flutter of apprehension despite the peaceful morning. Unexpected visitors still made her nervous, a lingering effect of the confrontations that had marked the winter months. But when Jed opened the door, it was Sheriff Hawkins who stood on their threshold, his expression unreadable. "Sheriff," Jed said carefully, his tone neutral but his posture alert. "What brings you out this way?" "Official business," Hawkins replied. But something in his manner suggested it wasn't the hostile official business of his previous visit. "May I come in?" Clara exchanged glances with Jed, then nodded. Whatever this was about, it was better to face it directly rather than let uncertainty fester. Hawkins entered the cabin and immediately noticed the changes that had taken place since his last visit. The additional room, the evidence of domestic prosperity, the peaceful atmosphere of a household that had found its rhythm. His eyes lingered on the marriage certificate, properly framed and hanging prominently on the wall, before moving to the cradle where Hope slept. "Congratulations on your daughter," he said quietly. "She's a beautiful child." "Thank you," Clara replied, still wary, but sensing that this conversation was heading in an unexpected direction. "I suppose you're wondering why I'm here," Hawkins continued, accepting the chair Clara offered but sitting stiffly as if unsure of his welcome. "The thought had occurred to us," Jed said dryly. Hawkins was quiet for a moment, clearly struggling with something he found difficult to express. "I came to apologize," he said finally, "and to bring you some news." "Apologize?" Clara couldn't hide her surprise. "Mrs. Boone," Hawkins paused, seeming to savor the proper use of her married name. I allowed myself to be manipulated by a man with selfish motives. I let personal prejudices cloud my judgment, and I treated you and your husband in a manner that was neither just nor kind." Clara stared at him, hardly able to believe what she was hearing. This was the same man who'd threatened to separate her from Jed, who'd forced them into a rushed marriage under threat of legal action. "What changed your mind?" Jed asked, his voice carefully controlled. "Henrik Paulson," Hawkins replied grimly. 3 weeks ago, he was arrested for attempted assault on a widow near Great Falls. Seems he's been targeting vulnerable women throughout the territory, using the same tactics he used against your wife. Threats, intimidation, enlisting sympathetic officials to pressure women into marriages they didn't want. Clara felt cold, despite the warmth of the spring morning. Other women? At least 4 that we know of, probably more. When we investigated his activities, a pattern emerged. Paulson would identify recently widowed women with property or resources he wanted, then systematically work to isolate them and remove any support systems they'd managed to build. "And you helped him do it," Jed said, his anger barely leashed. "Yes," Hawkins admitted quietly. "I did. I let his complaints about your immoral living arrangements convince me that I was protecting community standards when I was really serving his personal agenda. I'm deeply ashamed of my role in what happened." "To you?" Clara looked at this man, who'd caused her such anguish, trying to reconcile the remorseful figure before her with the rigid authoritarian who'd threatened her happiness. "Why are you telling us this, Sheriff? Because you deserve to know the truth. And because," Hawkins hesitated, then forged ahead, "because what I witnessed at your wedding changed something in me. I saw 2 people who genuinely loved each other, who'd found something beautiful despite difficult circumstances. I saw a community coming together to support that love instead of tear it down. It made me realize how wrong I'd been." "You were at our wedding?" Clara asked, confused. "Outside, watching through the window. I came to ensure the ceremony actually took place, I suppose. To make sure you weren't trying to deceive me about your intentions." Hawkins's face reddened with embarrassment. "Instead, I witnessed something extraordinary. A woman in labor, choosing to marry the man she loved, rather than let outside forces dictate her choices. A man standing by his bride through the most vulnerable moment of her life. It was the most genuine expression of commitment I've ever seen." The cabin was quiet except for the soft sounds of hope stirring in her cradle. Clara felt Jed's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining in the gesture that had become second nature during their months together. "Sheriff," Clara said finally, "I appreciate your apology, but what's done is done. We can't change how things happened." "No, but I can try to make amends," Hawkins replied. "Paulson has been sentenced to 5 years in territorial prison. His property is being sold to compensate his victims. If you're interested, there's a piece of land adjacent to your homestead that might be available at a very reasonable price." Clara and Jed exchanged glances, recognizing the opportunity being offered. Additional land would mean room to expand their operations, space for the children they hope to have, security for their growing family. "We'll consider it," Jed said carefully. "There's something else," Hawkins continued. "The territorial governor has been made aware of the situation, the pattern of harassment, the misuse of legal authority to serve private interests. There are going to be changes in how such complaints are handled in the future. Women won't be left so vulnerable to this kind of manipulation." "That's good news for other women," Clara said. "Though it comes too late for some." "Yes," Hawkins agreed heavily, "but perhaps some good can come from the harm that's been done." After the sheriff left, Clara and Jed sat together on their small porch, watching Hope enjoy her first spring sunshine. In a basket at their feet, the baby was fascinated by the play of light and shadow through the leaves, her tiny hands reaching toward the dancing patterns with wonder and delight. "How do you feel about his apology?" Jed asked. Clara considered the question, examining her emotions with the same care she'd once given to rationing winter supplies. Relieved, I think, not because I needed to forgive him, but because it means other women won't face what I faced. And I'm grateful he told us about the land opportunity. We don't have to make any decisions quickly, Jed assured her. We're doing fine as we are. I know, but I like the idea of expanding, of building something even bigger than what we have now. For Hope, and for the brothers and sisters we hope to give her. Jed smiled at that, the expression transforming his weathered face into something boyish and hopeful. Brothers and sisters, how many children are we planning to have, Mrs. Boone? As many as the good Lord sees fit to bless us with, Clara replied, using the phrase she'd heard frontier women employ when discussing such matters, though perhaps we could space them out a bit more than Hope's dramatic arrival might suggest. They were still laughing when Sarah Miller emerged from the cabin carrying her own infant son, born just 6 weeks after Hope, and named Samuel in honor of Sarah's father. The two babies had become fast friends in the way that only infants could manage, seeming to recognize each other as fellow travelers in the adventure of growing up. The men are talking about starting the corn planting tomorrow, Sarah reported, settling beside them with Samuel in her arms. Ray thinks the soil is finally warm enough. First crop as a married couple, Clara mused. It feels significant somehow, everything. Feels significant when you're building a new life, Sarah said wisely. The first crop, the first winter survived together, the first child born. All of it matters because it's yours. As the afternoon wore on, their small community gathered on the porch to enjoy the mild weather and plan for the work ahead. Ray and Jed discussed crop rotations and irrigation plans. The Miller boys played with wooden toys Jed had carved during the long winter evenings. The women talked about gardens and preserving and the 100 domestic considerations that would see them through another year. It was an ordinary afternoon in many ways, filled with the practical conversations and simple pleasures that marked frontier life. But to Clara, it felt like a celebration, a quiet acknowledgement of how far they'd all come since that bitter day when Jed had found her collapsed in the snow. As evening approached and the Millers prepared to return to their own cabin for the night, Clara found herself thinking about the strange currents that had brought them all together. Loss and loneliness had driven her to the brink of despair, but they'd also opened her heart to possibilities she'd never imagined. The challenges that had seemed overwhelming in isolation had become manageable when shared with people who cared about her welfare. "Penny for your thoughts," Jed said, as they stood in the doorway, watching their friends disappear into the gathering dusk. "I was thinking about beginnings," Clara replied, adjusting Hope's blanket as the baby dozed against her shoulder. "How sometimes what feels like an ending is really just the start of something better. Any regrets about how things turned out?" Clara considered the question seriously, reviewing the path that had led them to this moment. The grief of losing. Thomas would always be part of her, but it no longer defined her. The fear and uncertainty of facing winter alone had been replaced by the confidence that came from being part of a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine affection. "No regrets," she said finally. "Not about any of it. The hard parts made us appreciate what we have now. The struggles taught us to value each other. Even the interference from people like Henrik and Sheriff Hawkins, it forced us to fight for what we wanted, to prove that our love was worth defending. And now we have everything we need to build the life Thomas dreamed of for this place," Clara said, her voice filled with quiet satisfaction. "A family who loves this land, neighbors who've become true friends, plans that stretch into a future we can hardly imagine. It's not the life I expected to have, but it's the life I choose. Every day I choose it." Jed wrapped his arms around both his wife and daughter, holding them close as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called to its mate, and the wind carried the green scent of growing things across the valley. Inside their expanded cabin, the fire burned warm and steady, casting dancing shadows on walls that had witnessed so much change in such a short time. The marriage certificate hung in its place of honor, next to the photograph of Thomas that Clara had insisted on displaying, not as a shrine to the past, but as a bridge between the love she'd lost and the love she'd found. On the table, Jed's buffalo hunting knife lay beside Clara's mother's sewing basket, two artifacts from different lives that had somehow found harmony in this new existence they were creating together. Soon there would be other artifacts to mark their journey. Hope's first shoes, perhaps, or the deed to additional land, or the tools their children would use to continue building on the foundation their parents had laid. But for now, it was enough to stand together in the doorway of their home, watching the Montana sky darken into night, listening to the sounds of a world at peace. They had survived winter's fury and spring's uncertainties. They had built love from loneliness, and family from the ashes of loss. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new opportunities to choose each other and the life they were creating together. But tonight, Clara Boone was exactly where she belonged, in the arms of a man who cherished her, holding a daughter who represented all their hopes for the future, surrounded by the quiet satisfaction of dreams fulfilled in ways she'd never dared to imagine. The wind whispered through the aspens where Thomas lay buried, carrying with it the benediction of a love that had made room for new love, a past that had taught them to treasure the present, and a future that stretched ahead of them like an unwritten book, waiting to be filled with all the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary moments that make up a life well lived.